Mr. Speaker, and ultimately thousands of dollars a year to those who use home heating oil in their house. Speaker, I contrast that to the Conservatives. They are not offering long-term solutions to my constituents in Kings Hants to help them save thousands of dollars a year. We'll continue to focus on affordability and environmental progress at the same time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Mr. Speaker, in Châteauguay-Lacolle, families are very familiar with the climate crisis, and they want to do what they can for the environment. They know that using greener and cheaper heat pumps instead of continuing to use home heating oil is a good option. But the price of a heat pump can make it difficult, especially for lower-income households. Therefore, I'm very pleased with the federal program that helped people move from heating oil to heat pumps. It's already shown in my riding how useful it is, and I'm very pleased to hear that Quebec will continue to cooperate with our government to support these families and help them to find sustainable heating solutions. Unlike the Conservatives, who don't seem to have a plan to protect us from the climate crisis, we are committed to an accountable and fair transition to a clean economy.
The Honourable Member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou.
A Canada-wide warrant has been issued for high-risk sex offender Randall Hopley. His lengthy criminal record includes 3 sex offences against children. He served 6 years for kidnapping. He is such a risk that he was designated a long-term offender, meaning he had a supervision order for years after completing his sentence. He was charged with breaching that order. Rather than jail, he got bail to a halfway house. The protection? An ankle bracelet. Unlike a jail cell, ankle bracelets can be cut, and that's exactly what happened. Even NDP Premier, an ally of the Prime Minister, has raised alarm bells. He said, quote, everybody with a 4-year-old in their life is thinking about that child right now and the fact that this man is at large, end quote. This government needs to take child safety more seriously. No more bail for sex offenders. No more house arrest for pedophiles. The time has come and gone for this government to act. If this government doesn't want to act, then get out of the way, because we will.
Well said. L'Honorable Député de Sackville-Preston-Chesapeake.
Mr. Speaker, we know that putting a price on pollution and rebating all the proceeds back to Canadians remain the most effective way to fight climate change. In Canada, we are reducing emissions faster than any of the G20 nations. In Atlantic Canada, reliance on heating oil, which has gone up in price by 75% this year alone, and the rural nature of our regions created as challenges to our families. That's why we are increasing the oil-to-heat pump affordability grants for low and median income Canadians for homeowners installing a heat pump, which saves them up to $2,500 a year. Finally, the doubling of the rural top-up rebate and the temporary 3-year pause on price and pollution for home heating oil will help support Canadians in the transition to cleaner energy. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Manitoban Liberal MPs voted against our common-sense Conservative motion to scrap the carbon tax on home heating, proving once again that this Prime Minister just isn't worth the cost. After the vote, the new NDP Premier of Manitoba, Wab Kinew, declared that the carbon tax is not a silver bullet when it comes to climate change. Conservatives have been saying this for years. The carbon tax is a tax plan, not an environmental plan. That's right. If the Liberal government won't listen to Conservatives, maybe they will listen to Manitoba's newest NDP Premier and the 12 other ones who are opposing this inflationary tax scheme. The Premier went on to say that the reality is this: during this inflationary moment right now, people are suffering. And Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more. After 8 years of this NDP Liberal coalition, people can no longer afford to live. It's time for this Liberal government to take the tax off and keep the heat on for all Canadians, not just those who vote Liberal.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, along with all of Canada's premiers, Quebec's Premier sent a letter to the Prime Minister of Canada to ask for the carbon tax to be suspended on home heating. The Bloc Québécois claims to work for the interests of Quebec and to collaborate with the Quebec government, but instead is working against the Premier of Quebec. Instead, it's supporting the Liberal Prime Minister. Truth is stranger than fiction. Look at the Separatist Party, which is working closely with the Liberal Party of Canada. It's weird. In 2021, the Bloc was asking for the Prime Minister to leave, but now it seems to be his best friend and dance partner. The Bloc Québécois does not represent the interests of Quebecers. It has its own agenda. The leader of the Bloc has formed a coalition with the Prime Minister to keep the worst government in history in power for another 2 years. It's bizarre for a separatist party. I'd like to know what kind of baubles the Bloc Québécois is getting from the Prime Minister. If you vote for the Bloc, it'll have a steep cost.
Député de Egmont.
Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago we announced that for rural Canadians we doubled the quarterly carbon pricing rebate, and we are in discussions with provinces to make heat pumps essentially free for low and middle income households. On average, homeowners who switch from oil to heat pumps to heat and cool their homes can save up to $2,500 per year on their energy bills. This is good for families facing affordability challenges. It is important to have a clear plan towards clean energy that will protect Canadians from the devastating impacts of climate change and ensures farmers and fishers can continue to produce the food to feed Canadians and the world. We are committed to transitioning to a clean economy in a way that ensures no one is left behind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Elmwood, Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to celebrate 50 years of service to the Transcona community by the Kids Centre Co-op Nursery School. The centre began in 1973 as a University of Manitoba student project and quickly transformed into a neighbourhood co-op run by a parent board. Today it supports 76 children out of its location in Radisson School. I'm proud to say my own family has benefited from the exceptional learning environment offered by the co-op. I want to say a big thank you to all the parents and staff that have made the co-op a success. I know many teachers at the co-op, including Director Selena, are former parents or students. This is a testament to the quality of their work and the supportive environment it creates. I'm proud to have run on a commitment to a national child care strategy and to have pushed the current government to implement one. It takes many people to make such a strategy successful. Thank you to the people at Kids Centre Co-op and the child sector generally for their work. Thank you to the public servants who are administering the child care agreements, including a competent and dedicated team at Early Learning and Child Care Manitoba. Our future will be brighter for the work you do.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the little boy inside me is very pleased to rise to honour one of the idols of my youth, Pierre Turgeon, who will finally be ushered into the Hockey Hall of Fame. He was a native of Rouyn-Noranda, and he wasn't just a good hockey player. He brought our town to the Little League World Series in 1982. He could have been quite the ball player if he hadn't chosen hockey. He's the fifth person from Abitibi-Témiscamingue to be brought into the Hall of Fame after Dave Quéant, Jacques Laperrière, Serge Savard, and Rogatien Vachon. He received 1,327 points over 1,294 games. He received a Lady Byng. He was also the captain of the Habs. He carried the torch when the team moved from the Forum to the Molson Centre. What a career. He will always be someone that we keep in our hearts and our community. We'll always admire the Rouyn-Noranda magician and always carry the number 77 in our hearts.
The honourable member from Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, it is clear that the Prime Minister is not worth the cost. According to a recent Statistics Canada report, 1 in 3 Canadians live in a household experiencing financial difficulties. But despite these difficulties, the Prime Minister decided to respond to his declining polls and the revolt of the Atlantic Caucus and axed the tax, but for only 3% of the population residing in Atlantic Canada. But, Mr. Speaker, It's cold across all of Canada. And I have heard from people saying the cost of living has increased so rapidly and it greatly exceeds our income, we can only afford food on sale. And others are going out without meals totally. Canadians deserve better. When an opportunity came to help Canadians, we saw just yesterday the people in Thunder Bay are not being heard. They elected a Liberal, the MP from Thunder Bay, Superior North, who was proud to vote against this motion. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, Canadians want and need a care.
The honourable member from Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We want to give a reality check to the leader of the Conservative Party today, Mr. Speaker. Climate change is real. It is actually happening, Mr. Speaker. You know, as I pointed out, as the Conservatives like to flip-flop all over the place on the issue, I want to emphasize a point here for the member across the way. When it comes across to financing of oil, electricity, natural gas, which one do you think is the most costly to Canadians? It is oil, Mr. Speaker. One of the ways in which you can make a good difference is by getting Canadians to looking at heat pumps. Much like the Greener Homes program, Mr. Speaker, what we're seeing is tens of thousands of Canadians using heat pumps through the Greener Homes program. My question would be to the leader, when will the Conservative Party wake up, listen to Canadians, and realize that they need to care about the environment?
Hear, hear.
Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Now he's panicking. He's trying to save not only the carbon tax, but also his political career. And the Bloc is there to support him. The Bloc voted in favour of keeping the tax on home heating. And we learned in La Presse that the Bloc wants to keep the Liberals in power for another 2 years. We also learned in La Presse that there was a call between the Bloc Québécois leader and the Prime Minister, a call to protect and save this Liberal government's agenda. So, will they be transparent about all the conditions of this new costly coalition? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as everyone in this room knows, I am always willing to work with whoever wants to do more to fight climate change, who wants to do more to help Canadian families through these difficult times. I'm very happy that the Bloc Québécois has recognized that the best way to fight climate change is to put a price on pollution and to help families with associated costs. And that's what we're doing. I regularly have conversations with the Bloc Québécois leader, but I haven't had any recently. The last time we talked, the Bloc leader and I, we talked about the Middle East and Israel. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is desperate to save his carbon tax, especially on heat. And he started by giving a temporary pause to some people in a region where he was plummeting in the polls and his caucus was revolting. But then he found that the entire country was in revolt and he needed a new coalition partner to save him from my common sense confidence vote to take the heat off, to take the tax off the heat. He got that support from the Bloc Québécois. We now learn that he has been in discussions with the Bloc to help him stay in power for 2 years. What did he promise the separatists for them to enter into this costly carbon tax coalition?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to the divisive rhetoric that the Leader of the Opposition is putting forward, the measures we announced on transitioning people on oil to heat pumps apply right across the country. The doubling of the rural top-up right across the country. We're going to continue to work with Canadians to phase out home heating oil, which is dirtier and more expensive. And I want to recognize that we are willing to work with anyone in this House who will step up in the fight against climate change. And I thank the Leader of the Bloc Québécois for continuing to be firm on building a better future for all our kids, on fighting for climate change, against climate change on this and in other occasions. I welcome all parliamentarians to stand up in the fight against climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Now he's thanking the separatists for helping him save his carbon tax and support his plan to quadruple the tax on heat, gas, and groceries. This Prime Minister is playing a very dangerous game. First, he divided Canadians by giving a temporary pause to some people in a region where he was plummeting in the polls and his caucus was revolting. When all Canadians then revolted against this divisive plan, he's turned to the separatists who say that they are going to keep him in power for 2 years and that the leader of the bloc has had a call with the Prime Minister to do it. In the interest of transparency, will the Prime Minister reveal what he promised the separatists for them to join in this costly carbon tax coalition?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the level of divisiveness and the rhetoric of the Leader of the Opposition is truly unfortunate. Mr. Speaker, the vast majority of Canadians, like the vast majority of members in this House of Commons, recognize that climate change is real, recognize we need to continue to step up in the fight against climate change, not just for the well-being of the planet and future generations, but for families' bottom lines, for families' jobs and careers as well, and we will continue to do that. As members of this party know, of the House of Commons know, I exchange regularly with leaders of different political parties. I haven't spoken recently with the leader of the bloc except on the issue of the Middle East, but I'm always open to talking to any party leader that wants to talk about fighting climate change.
L'Honorable Chef de l'Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Divide and distract from the fact that Canadians, after 8 years of his government, cannot eat, heat, or house themselves. But in a strange way, he united all Canadians at the Premier's Conference, who all agree, all 10 of them unanimously disagree that the Prime Minister's approach to take the tax off temporarily for only some. They said that this federal carbon tax policy treats Canadians differently and they expect a change. Will the Prime Minister pull together all the premiers in an emergency carbon tax conference so that we can take the tax off and keep the heat on?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the measures we announced a couple of weeks ago help any Canadian everywhere across the country to get off home heating oil towards using a heat pump, which is cleaner, less expensive, and better for our future. These are things that we've done right across the country. Only the Conservatives would think that taking serious action on climate change and supporting Canadians right across the country with affordability measures would be divisive. Well, it is divisive if you think that climate change is fake. But for everybody else other than the Conservative Party, we know that we can come together to fight climate change.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Canadians know that the only thing fake is this Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, today the NDP flip-flopped on its flip-flop. First, they voted 16 times in favor of the carbon tax on home heat. Then they voted to quadruple the tax. Then yesterday, they panicked and flip-flopped and voted for my plan to take the tax off home heating, admitting that they were wrong all along. And now today, they said they're in favor of the tax on home heat by refusing my amendment. So will the Prime Minister tell us at 2:26 p.m. what is the NDP position on the carbon tax right now?
Not certain if that has to do with the administration. That question has to do with the administration of the House. But I do see the Right Honourable Prime Minister rising to his feet. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what is clear is that the Conservatives are all ready to try and divide Canadians one against the other in any possible way they can, when the reality is the only division around climate change is that Conservative politicians still doubt whether it's real or not, and certainly don't think we should be doing anything to fight climate change. However, everybody else across the country, in all different parties, knows that it's a real issue that we're going to continue to step up and fight, unlike the Conservatives that continue to look to divide and hide from the reality of climate change.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, what the opposition leader is talking about, this phone call, it never occurred. The only true thing that the member is saying is that we are separatist. The opposition leader, while we're talking about him, he spent $3,300 on Facebook ads between August and November. The Conservative Party spent $80,000. The Liberal Party spent $8,500, and the Prime Minister spent $20,000 on Facebook. Meanwhile, social networks are intimidating Quebec and Canadian media. How do they explain that? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, what's very clear is our political allegiances. Despite our political stripe, whether we're federalist or separatist, we always care about the environment and protecting children, and we will work with allies. Now, as for social networks and information shared with Canadians, we're trying to work very hard with Facebook and Google because they don't want to pay journalists for their work. We're going to continue to do everything that needs to be done to keep Canadians informed about that and about other issues, but we do have some work ahead of us. The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. We want the government to take a strong stance. We would support a strong stance by the Government of Canada. A few days ago, we learned that over 500 people were laid off at TVA. 500 people lost their jobs because of social networks stealing all the ad revenue of legitimate media. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and the Liberal government are encouraging them by giving them dozens of thousands of dollars each and every month. What kind of message does that send to people? What kind of message does that send to Meta, who doesn't seem to respect anybody? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we were extremely clear about how concerned we are by Meta's behavior in particular. Meta is indeed refusing to support our democracy. They are refusing to allow journalists to do their excellent and thorough work, which is essential to the proper functioning of our institutions and our democracy. We will continue to defend media against web giants that the Conservatives never seem to miss an occasion to defend. We will do everything that we can to keep Canadians informed throughout this. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
I know that the Prime Minister's plan on home heating was cynical and divisive, but the Conservatives are no better. They're more interested in playing games than actually helping people, because if they were genuine about helping people, they would support our plan to take GST off of home heating for all Canadians, to help people access clean and affordable ways to heat their home, and to make the big oil and gas companies pay for it. But we know that the corporate Conservatives will never stand up to big oil and gas, but will the Prime Minister support our plan to help all Canadians?
Hear, hear, hear.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we know that one of the things that helps Canadians is fighting climate change and supporting them in that fight against climate change. I know the NDP used to support phasing out coal. It is surprising to me that they are not supportive of phasing out heating oil, because that's exactly what we are doing. We're phasing out home heating oil because it is dirtier and more expensive for homes right across the country, and we're facilitating the delivery of heat pumps, including for free for low-income Canadians in provinces that choose to step up and participate. We're going to continue to fight climate change. I really wish the NDP were as unequivocal as that.
Order. Order. The Honourable Member from Burnaby South.
La question à laquelle on devrait...
Here is the question that we want an answer to. Will there be a break for all Canadians in our fight against climate change? All the Conservatives do is say slogans. Will their CEO friends allow them to vote to help Canadians? The Liberals want to pit regions against each other. Will the Prime Minister acknowledge his mistake and offer all Canadians a break on residential heating?
The
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we're offering more than just a break. We're offering thousands and millions of Canadians the opportunity to phase out heating oil because it's dirtier, it's more expensive, and there are too many low-income Canadians who currently depend on home heating oil. So we are going to help them transition to heat pumps. That's good policy. That's good policy for Canadians. That's a good policy to fight climate change, too. We are going to continue to be there to help Canadians, and we hope that all parliamentarians will join us.
The honourable member from Thornhill.
Prime Minister paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of families in region where he is plummeting in the polls. The Liberal minister from Newfoundland said if people in other regions wanted the same pause, that they should have elected Liberals. But people in York region elected Liberal MPs. In fact, 7 of them, and yet their constituents aren't getting the pause. Right. Yesterday, these MPs could have voted to take the tax off for the residents of York region, but they voted with the Prime Minister. So can anybody from York region stand up and explain their choice to leave their constituents in the cold?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said a number of times in this House, we have taken action that addresses affordability for particularly vulnerable Canadians. Heating oil costs 2 to 4 times that of natural gas. It accelerated by 75% in 2022, but we've done it in a manner that addresses the climate crisis at the same time and ensures affordability for people going forward. It will save $2,500 a year. It applies to people who live in every province and territory in this country, so long as provinces and territories step up. The shame in this chamber is that this party has no plan to address the climate crisis. I don't even know if they believe it, but they certainly don't act as though they actually think it's important.
The honourable member from Thornhill.
It certainly doesn't help the people in Newmarket, in Aurora, in Richmond Hill, in Woodbridge, in Markham, in Stouffville, or in North York. All of these communities got sold out by their Liberal MPs, and they can't even tell people why. They had a choice to stand with their communities, and instead they stood with the Prime Minister, and now they're hiding and hoping that everybody forgets. If these MPs won't listen to their constituents, won't advocate for them in the House of Commons, and won't even stand to defend their vote, then what are they even doing here?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This policy choice is about both affordability and about ensuring that we are addressing the climate crisis. I call on all provinces and territories to join us, certainly the Government of Ontario. Ontario has indicated an interest in moving forward with us on co-delivering this project, which would be enormously important going forward. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that yesterday the Leader of the Opposition essentially said that he will walk away from Canada's climate targets, eroding the Canada's credibility in the international community, eroding the ability of the world to address the climate crisis. This is enormously reckless, Mr. Speaker. It is an enormous risk for the future of our children. Shame on him.
The honourable member from Parry Sound Muskoka.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of Canadians in regions where he was plummeting in the polls. Then the Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said if people in other regions wanted the same pause, well, they should elect Liberals. But the people of Sudbury did elect a Liberal MP, and yet her constituents aren't getting a break. Yesterday, she could have voted to pause the carbon tax on all forms of home heating for the residents of Sudbury. But she voted no. Wow. Why is this government so committed to quadrupling their carbon tax that they forced the member for Sudbury to leave her constituents out in the cold?
Affordability, but also addresses the climate crisis. The Leader of the official opposition has no plan. He mouths taglines like technology, not taxes. Being the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, shame on them, having no plan for climate change, having no plan for the economy of the future.
I'm having some difficulty hearing members ask questions and to give answers, I would ask, please, that you do not exchange or engage in conversations across the aisle until you have the floor. The honourable member from Parry Sound, Muskoka.
Well, just this morning, the Environment Commissioner confirmed that this government's so-called climate plan is nothing more than a punishing tax on heat, gas, and groceries. And after yesterday's vote, it is crystal clear that this NDP Liberal government has no plan to make life more affordable either. Yesterday, the member for Sault Ste. Marie could have voted to pause the carbon tax on home heating for all the residents of the Soo and all of Northern Ontario. But he voted no. Why is this government so committed to
natural gas? Let us pick up for those people hardest hit, Mr. Speaker. Let's make sure that they get the break that they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your policy.
Colleagues, I'm going to ask the problems. The honourable member from Kenora.
The Prime Minister has paused the paying of his carbon tax for 3% of families in areas where he is plummeting in the polls. And the Liberal Rural Affairs Minister says if others wanted a similar pause, well, they should have elected more Liberals. Mr. Speaker, the people of Thunder Bay, Rainy River did elect a Liberal MP, yet they are not seeing this pause. And just yesterday, that member had an opportunity to vote to take the tax off and keep the heat on, but he voted against our common sense motion. So, Mr. Speaker, why is this government so committed to quadrupling the carbon tax that the member from Thunder Bay, Rainy River left the people of Northern Ontario outside in the cold?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said before, we've put forward a plan that addresses affordability in the long term for vulnerable Canadians who are suffering from high costs associated with home heating oil that has accelerated significantly in the last 2 years, but done it in a manner that is consistent with the fight against climate change, a fight that is not just Canadian, but is happening in countries around the world. I would say, Mr. Speaker, that it is the height of hypocrisy for the member opposite to be talking about this, about a price on pollution that they endorsed in their campaign platform, and it was part of the basis on which he was elected to this House.
The honourable member from Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, they have absolutely no plan for affordability after 8 years, which must be why the Prime Minister has paused his carbon tax paying for 3% of families. But people in Thunder Bay Superior North want to know why their MP, a Liberal minister, wasn't able to get the same pause for people across Northern Ontario. And just yesterday, she had the opportunity to vote to keep the heat on and take the tax off for people across Northern Ontario. So again, Mr. Speaker, why is this government so committed to quadrupling their carbon tax that the member from Thunder Bay Superior North was forced to leave the people of Northern Ontario out in the cold?
The honourable member, the honourable minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, it is shameful that the party opposite has no plan to address a crisis that is a crisis facing all of humanity. But I would tell you, in the modern age, having a recognition and acceptance of the realities of climate change is critical to having an economic plan that can be relevant for the future. What we hear is the Leader of the Opposition will cancel the Volkswagen battery manufacturing plant, that he opposes offshore wind and hydrogen development in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, that he would get rid of the Canada Infrastructure Bank, that would eliminate the small modular reactor project at Darlington. He is opposed to everything, and at the end of the day, he has no plan for the economy and he has no plan for the environment. There you go.
J'invite tous les députés.
I ask all members to please follow your whip's signals in order to keep calm here in this place. The honourable member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, 547 layoffs at TVA last week. It was the darkest day in the history of our TV industry. The federal government must realize that C11 and C18 will not be enough. The government must announce a $50 million emergency fund for news media, and the government must convene a General Assembly no later than this spring with all industry stakeholders to find long-term solutions to ensure the survival of the media. The future will be shaped by what we do right now. Will the minister create an emergency fund? And will the minister convene a stakeholder meeting?
L'honorable ministre Patrimoine Canadien.
The Honourable Canadian Heritage Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, of course, there has been a crisis in the media over the past few years, and we have seen the impact of that crisis on media across the country. That's why we've implemented programs to help. I'm, of course, very concerned about the announcement of the 547 layoffs. We're working on many different options which are on the table, and we're looking into everything we can do to support the media. But the Conservatives have systematically blocked us from modernizing our laws. If we had been able to modernize the Broadcasting Act in 2020, the first time we tabled the bill, then there might not be these layoffs happening today. So the Conservatives are not helping, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois supports successful immigration. We've said so loud and clear. That's why we want immigrants to be able to find housing. We want them to have access to a family doctor. We want their children to go to school in nice classrooms and to receive all of the educational support that they need. We want them to be able to learn French because that is the key to succeeding in Quebec. That's what integration capacity is all about, Mr. Speaker. That's what we mean. Will the Liberals finally realize that they are jeopardizing this by setting immigration targets that are totally out of sync with our integration capacity? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank our colleague for bringing up the very important and relevant issue of housing today. Today, we announced that the CMHC will build 28,000 new housing units over the next 5 years, including 5,000 affordable units. In fact, this has been accomplished over the past 5 years, and it's twice what has been accomplished over the past 30 years. So this is what we can do when we work together with not-for-profits, municipalities, and the federal government. All levels of government and all groups can work together to make more affordable housing units for more people in Canada.
L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals don't have a clue about Quebec's integration capacity. Why didn't they consult Quebec before developing their immigration levels? And in addition to refusing to consult Quebec's government, they refused to consult with organizations that don't have a Canada-wide mandate. They refuse to speak to Quebecers. They refuse to speak to Quebec. So it's thus very unsurprising that their immigration levels are totally out of sync with our integration capacity.
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. The member across the way is disconnected not only from Quebecers, but also from the news. Today, we heard news from Quebec, and the only way to fix the labour shortage is through immigration. That's one of the main solutions. Quebec's GDP is lower than expected because of labour shortage, lack of workers, and we need immigration to fix that. Successful immigration, of course. The honourable member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois separatists joined the Liberals yesterday in voting against our motion to remove the carbon tax for home heating for all Canadians. Yet, the Premier of Quebec signed a declaration with all other provinces to support our initiative. So the Bloc Québécois is working against the Premier of Quebec and for the Prime Minister of Canada. Who would have thought? What concessions did the Bloc Québécois get to keep this incompetent and costly Prime Minister in power?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know about you, but as for me, I'm a big fan of Infoman. And last week, Infoman did a segment on the Conservative Party of Canada's half-truths. They mentioned half-truths twice in their show. So Infoman determined that the Conservatives' claims are false. The Conservatives claim that the carbon tax has a 16% impact on carbon tax, but that is in fact false. It's 0.15%. Factually speaking. So that's a really great episode of Infoman with conservative untruths, and I recommend it to everyone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, this is quite funny. Infoman is now leading the government's future. After 8 years of this Liberal government, though, Mr. Speaker, a new coalition was formed yesterday, a Bloc Liberal coalition. We were already tired of the Liberal NDP coalition. Now there is another coalition, a separatist, independentist, federalist coalition, the Bloc Liberal coalition. The Bloc is supporting the Liberal Party so that they can stay in power for another 2 years. Now this government is known for its extravagant spending, and we want to know what the Bloc Québécois got in exchange for making this deal with the Liberal Party. The Honourable Environment Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's true that there is a coalition in this House. The Liberal Party of Canada, the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, and the New Democratic Party are all in this House, and all these parties believe that climate change is an existential threat. There's one party in this House that doesn't believe that, and that's the Conservative Party. So there are 4 parties in this House which believe that we need to take action against climate change, that we need to put a price on pollution, that we need to promote green energy, clean energy, and electrification of transports, and there's only one party in this House that doesn't believe in that, and that is the Conservative Party of Canada. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, it costs a lot to vote Bloc, and they demonstrated that once again yesterday. Yesterday, the new Bloc Liberal Costly Coalition voted against our common sense motion, which would have allowed Canadians across the country to keep warm in winter. We cannot say it often enough. They voted together to drastically increase the carbon tax at the expense of Canadians. They are not worth the cost. It's costly to vote for the Bloc, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, what concessions did the Bloc Québécois obtain in exchange for keeping this incompetent Prime Minister in power? The Honourable Minister. What is he talking about? Where was our colleague this summer when rivers were overflowing, when there were wildfires? Where was he this summer when people were displaced all over the place, Mr. Speaker? The Conservatives and their backward policies, they refuse to believe in climate change. They're climate change deniers. They want to move Canada backwards all the way back to the Stone Age.
Before we listen to the next question from the member for Lévis-Lotbinière, I would like to remind the member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier that his voice is rather loud, and it's important to keep his voice under control before he rises to speak in the House of Commons and is recognized. The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years of this incompetent Prime Minister, he's found a new partner. Yesterday, the new costly Bloc Liberal coalition voted to maintain the carbon tax on home heating for all Canadians. It's truly shameful. Mr. Speaker, for a second time, what concession did the Bloc Québécois obtain to keep this incompetent Prime Minister in power? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we won't take any lessons from people who thinks that humans and dinosaurs lived at the same time and that TV shows like the Flintstones are documentaries. We are going to fight climate change, and the Conservatives want to make us take a step back on the environment, on firearms, and bring us back to the Stone Age. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, endless announcements, the photo ops and rhetoric, but for all their talk, the Environment Commissioner has given the Liberals a failing grade in the climate change fight. Canada is going to miss its target, not least because we're still waiting for the emissions cap for the oil and gas sector. Under the Liberals, we're giving more public money to fossil fuels than any other G20 country. That's quite a feat. When will the Liberals wake up and take this crisis seriously? When the planet goes up in smoke? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, if my honourable colleague took the time to listen to the Commissioner of the Environment's press release, he said that the last year's plan is the best plan to fight climate change in the history of this country. I didn't say that. It's the Environment Commissioner that did. Should we do more to fight climate change? Of course. Would I be pleased to work with him and the Bloc and the Green Party to allow Canada to go faster and further on the fight against climate change? Yes. Despite what they're saying, yes.
The honourable member from Vancouver East.
The Liberals are out of touch with Canadians struggling to find a home that they can afford. They just handed over 6 parcels of federal land to wealthy developers, and only a small fraction of the homes built will be affordable. We're in a housing crisis. Rent is through the roof. Canadians are having to make impossible choices. Some end up living in cars or on the street. Canada needs at least 2 million non-profit homes. So why are the Liberals putting profits over people having an affordable home yet again?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to our colleague for raising the importance of investing in more housing. The good news is that we've just done that this morning. So this morning, with Canada Lands Company, we announced the construction of 28,000 additional new homes in the next 5 years. 20% of them, at least, will be affordable homes, which is 5 times the amount of affordable homes that we have constructed in the last 30 years. Mr. Speaker, there is more to do, including with non-profit housing providers. We're going to do that.
Bravo.
The honourable member from Yukon.
Mr. Speaker, even as weather, high prices and tough economic times, they remain deeply concerned about climate change. That's why Yukoners welcome actions from our government to reduce fossil fuel emissions while conserving energy and reducing costs. Contrary to a common misconception, Yukon-based studies have shown that heat pumps can operate efficiently in very cold climates. The Prime Minister has invited all interested provinces and territories to join the co-delivery program for heat pumps. Can the Minister of Natural Resources update the House on the progress in bringing this program to my riding in the Yukon?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to thank my colleague from Yukon for the question and his tireless advocacy for his constituents. Heat pumps have been well tested and adopted in northern climates for years. That is why we are working to deploy more cold climate heat pumps across the territory to reduce ongoing energy bills and to reduce emissions. In fact, heating oil actually serves over 50% of the population in Yukon, making it a pressing issue of affordability and climate. I had a conversation recently with the Premier of Yukon. He is extremely interested in moving forward on a joint delivery, and I expect that we will have good things to say very soon.
Then I have
the honourable member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, we saw the true colours of the Bloc. Once again, they let Quebecers down by voting with the Liberals. And when we say it costs a lot to vote Bloc, we saw the proof once again yesterday. Voting against the application of the tax break to all forms of residential heating in Canada for all Canadians, well, the Bloc voted against it. Incredible. This costly new Bloc Liberal coalition is doing nothing good for Quebec. What concessions did the Prime Minister make to the Bloc to hold on to power for another 2 years? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Last week, the Honourable colleague asked what my former Greenpeace colleagues thought of my work, and then he thought what Équiterre thought about it. And here's what they said. In terms of our plan, it's the first time that we have such a detailed strategy to attain our targets that we set. David Suzuki said, this plan has the best chance of success of any other previous Canadian plan. Greenpeace, for the first time, a climate plan in Canada sees the oil and gas sector significantly reducing its emissions. What is the Conservatives' plan? I don't see it.
The honourable member from Foothills.
The Prime Minister's Christmas gift to 97% of Canadians. Merry Christmas. You're going to have a carbon tax in your home heating this winter. The Prime Minister literally gave Canadians a lump of coal by voting against a common-sense Conservative motion to take the tax off and keep the heat on. Now, we thought the Liberal NDP's carbon tax coalition was bad, but there's a new addition to the carbon tax naughty list. The Bloc joined the Liberals and voted to keep the carbon tax on home heating this winter. Which gift did the Prime Minister leave under the separatist tree to protect his government for 2 more years?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, it is important to actually have a plan to address critical affordability issues in a long-term way, but also to continue to address the climate crisis. Those are the measures that we have put into place. I have to say again that I do find it the height of hypocrisy that my honourable colleague across the way, who ran on a platform that included putting a price on pollution, gets up in the House today and actually says what he's saying. It is the height of hypocrisy.
The honourable member from Foothills.
The Prime Minister joined the separatists to divide Canadians. Those Canadians will have to pay a carbon tax on their home heating over the winter, and 3% of Canadians who will get a pause on the pain. It's clear that the Liberals and the Bloc, their Christmas gift to Canadians is to punish families for heating their homes this winter. They voted against a common-sense Conservative motion to take the tax off for every single Canadian. Again, what Christmas wish did the Prime Minister grant the separatists for the Liberals to avoid an election on the carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I think every party in this House actually is concerned about affordability issues, but the only party in this House that does not care about the climate crisis is the Conservative Party of Canada. The only party that actually has no plan to address it and doesn't even believe that climate change is real. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition essentially said he would walk away from Canada's climate targets, walk away from every member of the international community. He would walk away from our children's future, and he would walk away from a clean economy that will actually create jobs and economic opportunity across the country. Shame on him.
The honourable member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
After 8 years, the revolting Atlantic Caucus and the panicking, plummeting Prime Minister now have 2 coalitions with which to flip Canadians the bird. The costly coalition with the NDP to drive the cost of everything up. Unfortunately, Canadians know too much about that. The other, according to the Quebec media, is with the separatist Bloc, who committed to keep the Liberals in power for another 2 years. The costly coalition Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister release his full carbon tax coalition agreement with the separatist Bloc?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think my honourable friend across the way used the word revolting. You know what is revolting? Are the tactics, the circus act that is going on in the Natural Resources Committee, blocking the passage of Bill C-49. It is endangering the health and safety of the translators in that committee. It is an enormous waste of taxpayers' money. It is opposing the Premier of Nova Scotia, the Conservative Premier of Nova Scotia, and the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. It will create jobs and economic opportunity for the future in a manner that is consistent with fighting the climate crisis. Shame on him.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-Beaupré, Île d'Orléans, Charlevoix. Mr. Speaker, the situation is very serious in Beauport, Côte-Beaupré. Here, 142 SMEs have announced they will go bankrupt if the federal government does not postpone CEBA repayment without loss of the subsidy. It's the same across the National Capital Region as well. While the Liberals are asleep at the switch, the Conservatives are defending oil. Our local small businesses are on the verge of bankruptcy. When will the government finally give them the 1-year deferral they need? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would like to inform my honourable colleague that roughly 9 million companies benefited from CEBA, and that is why we announced an extension of 1 year of the deadline for refund and greater flexibility in terms of financing. And this is in addition to the increase to the CCB and to the $10 a day daycare. This will allow more women to remain in the workplace. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Mr. Speaker, there is going to be a wave of small business bankruptcies if the federal government does not defer repayment of the CEBA loans without the loss of the subsidy. According to the Insolvency Professionals Association, last quarter, more companies filed for insolvency than in the last 10 years. In Beauport-Limoilou alone, 154 businesses have declared bankruptcy. How can the Liberals sacrifice them when all they're asking for is a 1 year postponement, not 18 days? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, we are proud to have created this program, which allowed us to provide $40 million to small businesses in Canada during the serious challenges they were facing. And I'd like to thank our partners for supporting these crucial programs, even though the Conservatives said our pandemic support wasn't good. What's important today is to underscore that small businesses now have until December 31st, 2026 to repay.
From Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals voted down our common-sense Conservative motion to axe the carbon tax on all forms of home heating for all Canadians. Now, the NDP leader said his NDP MPs would be supporting our Conservative motion to keep the heat on. However, not all British Columbia NDP MPs voted to take the carbon tax off. Now, after 8 years of this NDP Liberal government, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister quit forcing British Columbians' rates on British Columbia for the carbon tax rates, which he plans to quadruple on home heating?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have been saying, we have a plan to ensure long-term affordability for particularly vulnerable Canadians. The cost of heating oil is 2 to 4 times that of natural gas, depending on which province you live in. It is accelerated over 75% in 2022. It is a plan that actually addresses that in a way that will give savings to people over the long term. It will do it in a manner that fights climate change. I had the opportunity to speak with Premier Eby about it last week, and I believe that the people in British Columbia will have access to exactly the same proposal as everywhere else.
The Honourable Member from Lethbridge.
The Prime Minister paused the paying of his carbon tax on 3% of Canadian families in the areas where his polls were the lowest. The Liberal Rural Affairs Minister said this. She said that if people in other regions wanted to see a pause as well, then they needed to vote Liberal. But the people in Calgary Skyview did vote for a Liberal Member of Parliament, and yesterday he could have voted to keep the heat on and take the tax off, but instead he voted no to the people of Calgary Skyview. So why is this government so hell-bent on quadrupling their carbon tax that the member from Calgary Skyview left his constituents out in the cold?
Good.
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have said, we are moving forward on a program that will ensure long-term affordability for people who utilize heating oil, do so in a manner that is consistent with addressing climate change. I have reached out to my counterpart in the government of Alberta, and we will be having conversations about how Alberta can participate in this project moving forward. But I would say once again that it is time, and I think Canadians are expecting the Conservative Party to be able to at least tell folks that they believe in climate change, they have a plan for addressing the climate crisis in a manner that is consistent with long-term economic prosperity and affordability.
colleagues. I wasn't able to hear who had said that comment, but every member who is recognized by the floor to be able to speak has the right to do so until that time has expired, and the Speaker will let that person know. The honourable member from Lethbridge.
So what I heard from the member opposite is that this government is committed to picking winners and losers, and the winners are the 3% that use oil to heat their homes. They won't have to pay a carbon tax for the next 3 years, but the rest of Canada will. When the Minister for Rural Affairs was asked about this, she said, well, they just need to vote more Liberals in place and then we'll give them our attention, referring to those in other parts of the country, of course. Now, for those that live in the constituency of Edmonton Centre, they did elect a Liberal member of Parliament, and yet they were not showing that favoritism. They were not showing the benefit of having the carbon tax removed. And so my question is simple. Why is this government so hell-bent that the people of Edmonton Centre still have to pay the carbon tax on their home heating?
And again, I'm going to obviously offer the Minister an opportunity to respond, but I'll ask all members that I'm quite aware of the time that members have to pose and to respond to their questions. I politely decline their reminders as to how to do that. The Honourable Minister for Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the members opposite know that more than 8 out of 10 Canadians get more back than they pay. But why are we hell-bent on this? Because our planet demands it. Mr. Speaker, 15,000, that's the number of Canadians who died prematurely as a result of air pollution in the country. That cost $114 billion. It is escalating. If we refuse to take action on this, not only do we have a moral and fiscal imperative, but we have an obligation to ensure the party opposite doesn't return to attacking climate policies across the world and move back to an aggressive state where we cease making the project on climate action, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, more than 400,000 Quebecers still use home heating oil. Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are ready for the green transition, but not everyone has the means to replace their heater. And that is why programs like the Canada's Green Homes program and the affordable oil subsidy for heat pumps are very important. Can the Minister of the Environment tell us how these programs are used and how these programs can be enhanced in Quebec? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for her question. We know that home heating oil is the most expensive type of oil and has one that has seen the highest increase in recent years. Our heat pump program wants to save every family that has one $2,500 a year. And we're working with provinces to implement this program as quickly as possible to eliminate home heating oil across the country.
The Honourable Member from Selkirk Interlake Eastmain.
Manitoba's new NDP Premier has joined the chorus calling on these Liberals to pause the carbon tax. After 8 long years, everyone knows that this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost, and his Liberal MPs in Winnipeg are failing Manitobans. Yesterday, the member for Winnipeg North could have voted to take the tax off and keep the heat on for Manitobans, but instead he voted to leave his constituents out in the cold. And now these Liberals want to quadruple the carbon tax. Why does the member from Winnipeg North always follow orders from his Prime Minister at the expense of his own constituents?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, this is a policy that is about addressing affordability for folks who actually are suffering from the fact that heating oil is a much more expensive way to heat your home. We do this in a manner that actually will enable us to continue the fight against climate change and help folks in the long term with affordability concerns. I would tell you that we have had discussions with the Government of Manitoba. I look forward to being able to move forward on a joint basis with the Government of Manitoba, and I'm pleased to see the Government in Manitoba actually recognize the existence of climate change, something that the Honourable Opposition does not do.
The Honourable Member from Provencher.
After 8 years, we now have the Socialists
the separatists, and this Prime Minister who's just not worth the cost. They're all part of this costly carbon tax coalition that is leaving Canadians out in the cold. The Rural Affairs Minister recently told Manitobans that if they wanted a tax break, they had to elect more Liberals. Well, guess what? The folks in St. Boniface, St. Vital did elect a Liberal, and they're still paying the carbon tax. Yesterday, he had a chance to vote to keep the tax off and the heat on for his constituents. Why did that member choose to leave the members of St. Boniface, St. Vital in the cold?
I would like to remind all members in their preparation of questions that the questions should be directed towards the government or the parliamentary secretaries, anything that is, or to committee chairs, for the purposes of related to the business of the government or of the House. That a question to a member is not one that is normally recognized. I think I saw a minister standing up on this issue, but if there is no minister standing up, the minister is standing up. If the minister wishes to answer this question, the minister certainly can. The Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
We're talking, Mr. Speaker, so I was sitting. I'm a Liberal and a proud socialist, Mr. Speaker, but this reminds me of a certain quote from Prime Minister Harper, who talked about the fight against climate change as a socialist plot. That's what the Conservative Party, and here it is, you have it again, Mr. Speaker. They do not believe that climate change is an issue. They do not believe we should do anything about it. They oppose electrification of transportation. They oppose deals like Volkswagen, Stellantis, and Nordvolt. They oppose wind development off the shores of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. They have no plan to fight climate change. They have no plan for the economy. They have no plan for the future of Canada. Bravo!
The honourable member from Flamborough-Glenbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The leader of the NDP said his caucus would be voting against the divisive decision by the Prime Minister to pause the payment of the carbon tax for just 3% of Canadians while doing nothing for the rest. However, in yesterday's vote, the member from Hamilton Centre didn't even bother to vote. If the NDP member from Hamilton Centre won't do his job, Conservatives will. Will the Prime Minister quit forcing Ontarians to pay a quadrupled carbon tax on their home heating?
The Honourable
Prime Minister. We ask the Prime Minister.
So I would like to just point out that question, although the preamble dealt with a member who is not of the government, the final part of the question, and that sort of hybrid question, was directed towards the Prime Minister. So the honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if that member opposite is so concerned about helping Ontarians, then he should be asking the Premier of Ontario to join the program to provide free heat pumps to the hundreds of thousands of Ontarians who would qualify. As he knows, and as every member in this House full well knows, this is a program that applies across the country to transition folks away from home heating oil so that they don't have dirty, more expensive ways to heat their home. We can do this for cheaper, and we can help Canadians both with affordability and the existential threat of fighting climate change, something that Conservatives continue to deny. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, very good.
The honourable member from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, 85,000 British Columbians still rely on oil to heat their homes, an extremely polluting fuel that is up to 4 times as expensive as natural gas. Recently, the Government of Canada announced a new affordability package that will help Canadians ditch expensive and polluting oil furnaces for heat pumps that will save them money on their home heating bills and fight climate change. Recently, BC's Premier David Eby was seen at the Premier's meeting proudly donning an I Love Heat Pump shirt. Can the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources provide an update to this House on the progress being made to bring this important affordability measure for British Columbians?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to acknowledge the question from my colleague and my neighbour, and recognize his ongoing advocacy for the people and the environment of West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country. Canada works best when Canadians work together. We are reaching out proactively to every province and territory to discuss participation in this important program to address affordability issues in a manner consistent with fighting climate change. We have had very good discussions with Premier Eby and Minister Osborne, and I expect we will have good things to say for the people of British Columbia in the very near term.
The honourable member from Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Winnipeg's Christmas Cheer Board is anticipating record demand for their hampers due to the cost of living crisis. 19,000 requests so far this year. And while big corporations are jacking up food prices, the Liberals throw up their hands, and the Conservative leader, the corporate champion from Carleton, stays silent. The Christmas Cheer Board doesn't know if they can meet this demand for help. Will the government support the NDP's bill to lower food costs and give Winnipeg families the help they need? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to remind all members that referring to a particular member using a mock title is not considered to be parliamentary. I see the minister standing up to answer this question. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. We know right now that many Canadians are having a hard time putting food on the table, and that's exactly why we continue to do the hard work on this side of the House to support Canadian families and organizations doing that work, whether that's from the Community Services Recovery Fund or whether that's the work that we're doing to develop the national school food policy amongst our partners. We are here to support Canadian families, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
The gap for First Nations infrastructure is at $350 billion. The government committed to end the gap for First Nations by 2030, but the Liberals have spent less than 3% of what is needed. This does not even include funding for Métis and Inuit, which would make the gap even more extreme. Indigenous communities remain neglected despite the calls for actions. When will this government recognize Indigenous people's capacity and work with them to fill these gaps?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Nunavut for this really important question. In fact, after a decade under the Harper government of no investments in First Nations communities, our government got to work with First Nations partners to start to close that infrastructure gap on things like clean water, Mr. Speaker, boil water advisories that have been left unattended for a decade, on things like housing, Mr. Speaker, community centres, health centres and schools. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member opposite. The gap is huge, but we are making progress with Indigenous leadership, and I'm very proud of that.
And with that, we come to the end of question period. I do see a point of order. The honourable member from Provencher.
Mr. Speaker, after I asked my question, you indicated that the questions should be directed through you to a Minister of the Crown and not just to any random Liberal. Well, in fact, I was asking my question to the member of St. Boniface St. Vital, who is a minister of the Crown. He's a minister of Northern Affairs, who did not vote in favor of reducing home heating bills for his constituents. And so it was actually a minute.
I'd like to thank. I would like to thank the member from Provencher for pointing that out. And as Speaker, I'd like to apologize to the member for making that declaration. I did not make the connection between the member's name as well as the role that he played in government. So my apologies to the honourable member from Provencher. The honourable member from Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you would know, Standing Order 17A provides that all members must rise in their own places to be recognized by the Speaker. Today, during question period, a Liberal member of Parliament flagrantly violated that rule and yet was recognized. So I'd like to know why the Liberal member for Pontiac was recognized when they were not in their seat.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for raising this issue. I will take a look at that and get back to the House if necessary. Thanks to the member for Perth Wellington. The
honourable member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During question period just now, the Environment Minister misled this House. And I would like to seek the unanimous consent of the House to table news articles that say that Équiterre is suing the minister. I would like to hear the rest, but I have heard many signals that there is not unanimous consent for that motion. I thank the member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier.
Now the member on rising on a point of order, the member from Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the question from the member for Winnipeg Centre, you commented on the use of mock titles, and I would remind you, Mr. Speaker, that NDP Liberal Government or Liberal NDP Coalition is also a mock title. If you need evidence, we now have the same members coining a term, liberal separatist coalition. They didn't call it a coalition when they voted with the Liberals on M79. They're raising the question of confidence.
I would like to thank the member from Elmwood Transcona for raising this issue. I think it's an important issue to clarify for all members who are here. When a member of Parliament, an individual, is referred to in a way that has a mock title or a mock name or mocking the name of the riding, that is considered unparliamentary. When it's referring to the party or to the group, as much as I personally don't find it very helpful, it has been the tradition of this place to allow those comments which are not directed towards an individual member to be considered acceptable in this House. I would like to take this opportunity, however, to please remind all members that to ensure that there is decorum in the House, as well as to show a fundamental respect that all members and that all parties, which are just composed of members, I ask you to please exercise great restraint when you're referring in a way to a group of folks in a tone that could be interpreted as being mocking. On a point of order, I see the honourable member for Kitchener Centre rising to his feet.
Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Seeking your clarification on the same point of order, I believe that the member for Elmwood Transcona both spoke to mock names, but also use of terms like coalition. For example, today, this talk of a Liberal bloc coalition when they voted together. For example, yesterday, the NDP voted with the Conservatives. Is that a new coalition? And are we going to be allowed to use the word coalition when two parties simply vote the same way? I'd appreciate your clarification. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the member from Kitchener Centre for this. And matter of fact, this issue was raised by the member for New Westminster Burnaby last week. The chair is currently considering this matter, and I will be coming back to members in the days to follow.
She is
Order. Order. I'm going to recognize the member from Lakeland, but I'm going to ask the member of Lakeland to please quote the point of order, or to try to make it very brief so that we can move on to the business of this House. The honourable member from Lakeland on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I'm the type of person who has a hard time saying hello in a minute, so I'll try to do this efficiently. Thanks to the Peanut Gallery for your input. So, Mr. Speaker, just on this, as you deliberate on what we can and can't say here and what kind of topics we can and can't ask about, I just have a question. If in the process of all that, you can also consider when members are asking questions that are clearly provincial policies, or they're clearly about provincial governments, or they're clearly about topics that actually, or they're partisan, and they're clearly about topics that really aren't government policy. I'm assuming that, that's going to go into your deliberation. You'll get back to all of us on that too. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the member. May the honourable member from Timmins James Bay please take a seat. I will recognize him in due order. So I'd like to thank members. I would like to assure all members that I can quite easily ask members to sit down on my own. I thank you for your offers of assistance, but it's much better for me to handle it here. I'd like to thank the member for Lakeland for raising this issue. However, and that is part of the reflection which I'm having, but I can mention it has been a long tradition in this House that sometimes questions might take the form of a hybrid method. From time to time, speakers have tried to curtail this. I know that my predecessor from Regina Capel tried to do this as well, to try to get people to not ask questions that start off in one direction and then at the last minute switch into a matter of government administration. This is something which is being considered, and I will get back to all members, as I would promise to get back to the member from New Westminster, Burnaby. The honourable member from Timmins James Bay rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate your reflection on that. In question period, I think if you'll check the Hansard, the Minister for Environment claimed that he was a Liberal and a Socialist. I'd like to ask him to withdraw those comments. They're deeply offensive.
It's always good to have a bit of levity, but that is not a point of order. It being 3:30, pursuant to order made on Monday, November 6, 2023, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded divisions on the motion at report stage of Bill C-34. Call in the members. La mise aux voix porte sur la motion numéro 1.
The question is on motion number 1. A vote on this motion also applies to motion number 2.
Mr. Champagne, appuyé par
Mr. Champagne, seconded by Mr. Huson, moved that Bill C-34, in Clause 4, be amended, A, by replacing lines 2 and 3 on page 3 with the following. Notice for review under Section 15 within 45 days after the certified date referred to in paragraph A.
La période de 10...
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Champagne.
Mr. Champagne.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Ms. Ian.
Ms. Ian.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Mr. Hernandez Sangri.
Mr. Hernandez Sangri.
Ms. Jacek.
Ms. Jacek.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Fragiscatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Kuzmarchek.
Mr. Kuzmarchek.
Mr. El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbel.
Ms. Vandenbel.
Monsieur Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
May Cambridge.
Mr. Yacono.
Mr. Yacono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Louis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Van Bynen.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Taylor Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Kwan.
Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Ms. Barron.
Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Zerillo.
Zerillo.
Mr. Bouleris.
Mr. Bouleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. McPherson. Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Dung.
Mr. Dung.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Ms. Stubbs.
Ms. Stubbs.
Mr. Paulus.
Monsieur
Norfolk. Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bertol.
Mr. Bertol.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay Edmonton West.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Melillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Patzer.
Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Van Popta.
Ms. Rude.
Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Mazier.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Battleford Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. F.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion.
All those opposed to the motion, please rise.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings. I would like to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended. If there are members who are unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function and the chair will recognize them. The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 324, 324. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
I declare motion number 2 carried. The question. Sorry. I must correct my statement. I declare motion number 1 carried, and therefore motion number 2 carried. Thank you. The question is on motion number 3.
Seconded by Mr. McLean. Moved. May I dispense? Move that Bill C-34 be amended by deleting Clause 15. The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bertol.
Mr. Bertol.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mr. Abultaif.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Monsieur Lew.
Monsieur Lou.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Couric.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Colney.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McLean.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Mr. Bouleris.
Mr. Bouleris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Davies.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Mr. Champagne.
Mr. Champagne.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Madame Le Boutillier.
Mr. Hernandez-Sangri.
Mr. Hernandez-Sangri.
Ms. Jasic.
Ms. Jazik.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Arsenault.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamuter.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragascatos.
Fragascatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmerchek.
Mr. Kuzmerchek.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. Aria.
Monsieur El-Khoury.
Monsieur El-Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yakano.
Mr. Yakano.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hepner.
Ms. Hepner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Hanley.
Mr. Hanley.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Mr. McDonald Malpec.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Garon.
Monsieur Garon.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Bellefeuille.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Godreau.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Laroche.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Dong.
Mr. Dong.
La Chambre attendra maintenant.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer.
I would like to inform the House that the electronic voting period has now ended. If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 140, 140. Nays contre 183, 183.
Je déclare la motion numéro.
I declare motion number 3 defeated.
Monsieur Champagne.
Mr. Champagne, seconded by Ms. Leboutillier, moves that Bill C-34, an act to amend the Investment Canada Act, as amended, be concurred in at report stage with further amendments.
Si un député participant en personne.
If a member participating in person wishes the motion be carried or carried on division,
en personne.
Or if a member of a recognized party participating in person wishes to request a recorded division, I would invite them to rise and indicate it to the chair.
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Request a recorded vote, please.
La période de 10 minutes.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started, and the House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Gould.
Monsieur Champagne.
Monsieur Champagne.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Bennett.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Chager.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Monsieur McKinnon-Gatineau.
Madame Leboutillier.
Madame Leboutillier.
Mr. Hernandez-Sangari.
Mr. Hernandez-Sangari.
Ms. Jacek.
Ms. Jacek.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Baptiste.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Kuzmarchuk.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. El Khoury.
Mr. El Khoury.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Fillmore.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Hardy.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Calloway.
Mr. Calloway.
Mr. Vandenbelt. Ms. Vandenbelt.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Yacono.
Mr. Yacono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Longfield.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
McDonald Avalon.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Madame Shanahan.
Madame Shanahan.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sorbara.
Mr. Sorbera.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Madame Mendez.
Madame Mendez.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Cotto.
Mr. Cotto.
Back to Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald-Malpeck.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Hallan.
Mr. Hallan.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Lewis Essex.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Dorothy.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Williams.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Redikoff.
Mr. Van Popta.
Van Popten.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Morantz.
Mr. Major.
Mr. Major.
Mrs. Falk Balford Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk Balford Lloydminster.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Monsieur Gould.
Monsieur Gould.
Mr. Couric.
Mr. Kerr.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. F.
Mr. Bragdon.
Bragdon.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. McLean.
McLean. Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Shield.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Falk-Provencher.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Terrien.
Monsieur Terrien.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Monsieur Beaulieu.
Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Singh.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Massey.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Cannings.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Green.
Mr. Green.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Backrack.
Mr. Backrack.
Ms. Zerillo.
Ms. Zerillo.
Mr. Boulouris.
Mr. Boulouris.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Angus.
Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Blakey.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Dong.
Mr. Dong.
Que tous ceux qui s'opposent à la motion veuillent bien se lever.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la
The House will now wait for the electronic voting period to end before resuming its proceedings.
Je désire informer la Chambre que la période.
I wish to inform the House that the electronic voting period has ended.
Si les députés n'ont pas.
If members were not able to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler.
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 322, 322. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
Déclare la motion adoptée.
I declare the motion carried. When shall the bill be read a third time?
Troisième fois à la.
At the next sitting of the House.
D'accord. À l'ordre, je vois.
Order. I see the government House leader rising on a point of order. Thank you very much.
Rising to add my voice to the point of order raised on Thursday, November 2nd and Friday, November 3rd by the member for Burnaby, New Westminster, respecting our rules and practices that questions posed by members during oral questions must be within the administrative responsibilities of the government or of the individual minister addressed in the question. Let me start by stating I agree with the member for Burnaby, New Westminster on this point. New Westminster Burnaby, I stand corrected. The member has raised excellent precedents to support his argument, and I would like to summarize these precedents and add my own perspective to the matter before this House. The member raised rulings from the member for Regina Capel when he was Speaker. I will submit that the member for Regina Capel has been consistent in his approach on this matter when he was in the chair and more recently. On January 28, 2014, the Speaker ruled with respect to this matter, and I quote, "As Speaker Milliken stated in a ruling of June 14, 2010, that the use of preambles to questions to attack other members does not provide those targeted with an opportunity to respond or deal directly with such attacks. This, unless there is a link to the administrative responsibilities of the government, can be established early in the question to justify them. Such questions can be indeed have been ruled out of order by successive speakers. We have witnessed a growing trend. We hear preambles to questions that go on at some length to criticize the position, statements, or actions of other parties. We have therefore an example of a hybrid question, one in which the preamble is on a subject that has nothing to do with the administrative responsibility of the government, but which concludes in the final 5 or 10 seconds with a query that in a technical sense manages to relate to the government's administrative responsibilities. It would be helpful if the link to the administrative responsibility of government were made as quickly as possible." End quote. I would now like to address the question of consistency on the matter by the member for Regina Capel raised earlier in my submission. I draw to the attention of the House a question raised during oral questions on Wednesday, June 21st, 2023 at 3:10 p.m. by the member for Kings Hants respecting the Conservative Party. As you and all members of this House can see from the video of this question, at 3:11 p.m. the member for Regina Capel was standing beside the Speaker in heightened agitation, pointing his finger and admonishing the Speaker that this was an inadmissible question. I agree with the member on the facts, but certainly not on the approach. In this case, the Speaker did rule that the question from the member for Kings Hants did not qualify as a question. Following oral questions that day, the Speaker ruled at 3:28 p.m. and stated, and I quote, "This is not to explain my answers, but so everyone here will know why I said it was not a valid question. The point I was looking at is on page 509 of House of Commons Procedure and Practice, which states, ask a question that was within the administrative responsibility of the government or of the individual member addressed. The reason I did this is there was a long preamble that really had nothing to do with administration. That is the reason I said it was not a valid question. When members are putting their questions together, I ask both sides to put something together that has to do with administration, and if they can, to make my life easier, to make it clear that it has nothing to do with the administration right from the beginning." End of quote. In conclusion, there are many clear precedents that support that questions during oral questions must be within the administrative responsibilities of government. There is no doubt on this matter, Mr. Speaker. We must all abide by these rules if we have any hope of restoring the dignity of this place and better comport ourselves in this august House of Commons. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci, l'honorable.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Government Whip. And I would also like to thank all those who have participated in this debate. I will take all this under consideration and I will come back to the House with it.
The honourable member from Perth Wellington rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a different point of order, I guess I normally point out this on behalf of one of my own colleagues, but during the recent votes, a colleague walked out during the vote announcement, therefore, before the vote announcement, therefore negating his vote. This was done on purpose because this member was to be paired with a minister and not supposed to vote. Therefore, I would ask the vote for the member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier's vote not count on the first group votes on motions 1 and 2 of report stage of Bill C-34.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for Perth Wellington for bringing this to the attention of the House. Very honourably done. Because the vote has already been tabulated and reported to the House, this would require unanimous consent of the House to remove that vote. Does the member have unanimous consent? Agreed. I thank the member once again from Perth Wellington. Orders of the day.
Government orders, business of supply, opposition motion, standing in the name of Mr. Backrack, Skeena Bulkley Valley, reducing home heating costs, resuming debate.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Burnaby South.
Speaker, I'll be splitting my time with the member for Elmwood Transcona. Madam Speaker, I am very happy and proud to debate our plan to save all Canadians money this winter and to fight the climate crisis. Heating your home in our country, in Canada, is essential. And Canadians are already faced with a high cost of living. And they're looking down at a cold winter and are deeply concerned about increased costs. For the Liberals, it seems like home heating is only an issue if they have their seats they have to save. But for Liberals, it sounds like home heating is only an issue if their seats are at stake. For the Conservatives, that's all a political game. They're not serious about helping people. If they were, they'd be supporting our plan. But the reality is, they're not going to support our motion to take GST off of home heating for all Canadians, to help Canadians find more affordable and cleaner ways to heat their home, because we want to take on big oil and gas. And corporate Conservatives will not stand up to big oil and gas.
That's right.
Establishment Liberals are so out of touch, they think that they need to divide the country. And corporate Conservatives are so beholden to the big oil and gas lobby that they won't stand up for all Canadians. If we want to take on the climate crisis, it's going to require everyone coming together. It's going to require everybody working together to make life more affordable, to create good jobs, and fight the climate crisis. But with climate delay Liberals and climate denying Conservatives, they both want to divide the country. We've got climate delay Liberals dividing the country based on who voted for them, and climate deny Conservatives that don't even believe we have a problem in the first place. Our plan is to stand up for all Canadians. Our plan is to take the GST off of home heating for all Canadians, help everyone be able to have heating that's clean and affordable, and make the big oil and gas companies pay for it. That's our plan. The challenge is, will the corporate Conservatives finally stand up to their CEO and big oil and gas lobbyists, or will they continue to cave in and do their bidding? And will the establishment Liberals stop dividing Canada and support our plan that helps everyone? Si les conservateurs sont
If the Conservatives really care about helping people, rather than just spouting slogans, then they will support our motion. Our plan will reduce bills for all Quebecers, unlike theirs. It will make it easier to install heat pumps, especially for those who need it the most. And it will ensure that the bill is paid by big oil companies. Unfortunately, we know that the Conservatives are basically just here to play games, which is a pity, because Quebecers deserve help.
The leader of the Conservative Party loves his slogans, but today he has a chance to axe the GST tax on home heating.
That's right. You're here.
But what is he going to do? He's not going to support this motion because the corporate Conservatives are beholden to big oil and gas lobby.
That's right.
It's very informative that the reason they're going to vote against this is because, one, we want to help all Canadians have access to cleaner and more affordable ways to heat their home, and because we want big oil and gas to pay for it by taxing their excess record profits and the corporate conservatives don't have the guts to stand up to their corporate masters. That's right.
That's right.
But why is that? Why is that the case that the corporate conservatives are so beholden to the oil and gas lobby? Well, it's actually not hard to figure out why. Half of the governing body of the Conservative Party is made up of oil and gas and other lobbyists for greedy CEOs.
Shame. Shameful.
Their governing party is made up of lobbyists who want to continue to defend the billions of dollars of profits of oil and gas and other corporate sectors rather than stand up for Canadians. That's why they won't be voting for this motion today. The Conservatives are very quick to cut services to Canadians, to take away the services Canadians need, but they are so reluctant to make the big corporations finally start paying what they owe to put money back into the pockets of Canadians, to pay for the services that Canadians need. Well, it's not surprising, because corporate conservatives will always side with big lobbyists, big CEOs, and big corporations. Madam Speaker, last year alone, the biggest oil and gas companies in Canada brought in $38 billion in revenue. People are struggling to heat their homes. People are struggling to fuel their cars, while those companies rake in record profits. How is that fair? Shouldn't be a surprise. This is a system that's been designed by establishment liberals and corporate conservatives to continue to benefit those at the very top at the detriment and harm to working Canadians. Now, they're going to do everything they can to protect the status quo. Last year, the establishment liberals and the corporate conservatives teamed up to defeat a motion that we had that would have made the big oil companies pay what they owe. New Democrats have your back. We're not backing down. We believe Ottawa should work for you, not for the CEOs, not for corporate Canada. That's why today we're calling on the elimination of GST off of home heating, a measure that's going to help all Canadians in all regions. We want to make it easier for families to have access to clean and affordable ways to heat their home, and we want to tax the excess profits of big oil and gas companies to pay for it. That's right. This is a plan that's fair, that saves all Canadians money when it comes to heating their homes and helps us continue to fight against the climate crisis. Madam Speaker, you'll find this quite amusing. This summer, and also very sad, this summer, the leader of the climate denial Conservatives had to cancel his climate denial tour because of climate disasters.
No way.
After all the scientific evidence and the concrete and devastating impacts of climate crisis here in Canada, after all the scientific evidence and also the concrete impacts to the climate crisis here in Canada, how is it possible that Conservatives continue to deny this reality? Well, because climate action hurts the pockets of big oil companies. It hurts their profits. And the Conservative government, the Conservative Party, as you all know, is made up of, the Conservative Party's governing body is made up of lobbyists. 50% are lobbyists for these big oil and gas companies and other corporations, and that's why they don't want to take action on the climate crisis, because it's going to hurt the profits of their corporate masters. They're not interested in helping all Canadians save money, which is what our motion would do, because they would take on the big oil and gas masters of the Conservative Party. They're just here to continue to support the oil and gas sector and other corporate sectors, while Canadians are squeezed between Mr. Climate Delay and Mr. Climate Deny. New Democrats are showing another option, an option where we unite the country, make life more affordable, and continue our fight against the climate crisis together. Maintenant qu'ils craignent de perdre des sièges.
Now that they're worried about losing seats, the Liberals have decided that they're going to help some Canadians with the price of home heating. But unfortunately, that help is only intended for ridings that the Liberals are trying to save. Climate action should be fair. It should not be divisive. There should not be any favoritism on behalf of the government. All Canadians deserve help with the price of home heating these days in these tough times. And if the government wants better environmental results, the government should help more people make good choices for their wallets and for the planet, with better subsidies. That's the plan that the NDP has. We want to help people with their home heating bills. We want to support Canadians in making better choices for the planet. And we want big oil to pay.
Merci. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I could not agree more with the leader from the NDP that climate change is not some passing fad. It's the crisis of our generation. It's an emergency. And I also couldn't agree more that the Conservative big oil lobby is on display every single day in this House, denying that climate change exists, denying that climate change is human-caused, and denying that it is a priority for the government or for Canadians. So I was disappointed yesterday, to be very frank, that the NDP decided to vote with the Conservatives on a motion to reduce the integrity of carbon pricing in Canada, Madam Speaker. I was glad to see a few NDP members, I think 6 NDP members, abstain from that motion, which was heartening. But how can the leader of the NDP justify his efforts to scale back our priority, which is pricing carbon and reducing emissions, when at the same time bringing a very similar motion forward today?
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Thank you very much for the question. What the Liberal government did was present a plan that divides our country, that creates unfairness. And there is no way we can fight the climate crisis and make life better for people if we pit regions against each other. So we voted against that unfairness. But let's be clear. While I absolutely agree that the climate denial of the Conservative Party hurts the efforts to protect the future for our kids and our present right now when we're faced with extreme weather, but the climate delay of the Liberals is also harming that effort. And I want to say to Canadians, you don't have to choose between climate delay or climate denial. You Democrats have a path where we can support our country together, help everyone save money when it comes to the cost of heating their homes this winter, help everyone when it comes to choosing better alternatives that are cleaner and more affordable, and continue to fight to protect our planet.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for York Simcoe.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the Leader of the NDP for his speech, and I want to try and find common ground. I think him and I would both agree that the carbon tax disproportionately affects rural Canadians more than urban. And in my riding of York Simcoe, we are now classified as urban. I think the Leader of the NDP knows my riding as the soup and salad bowl of Canada, ice fishing capital of Canada, and home to the Chippewas of Regina Island First Nation. And according to the Liberals, like I said, we are now classified as the City of Toronto, being 70 miles outside of Toronto. And we have no streetcars, we have no subways, we have no Uber. And as unbelievable as this is, Madam Speaker, we have no hospital. We have to drive 40 minutes to get to a hospital. So I would like to ask the Leader of the NDP how he thinks that is fair, that we don't get the rural top-up or the doubling of the rural top-up, as meager as it is, and it is helpful to some. We don't get that.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
I think it's very problematic that the Honourable Member's riding doesn't have access to health care or a hospital. And I wonder who the provincial government is in the riding that the member represents. I'm pretty sure that that government has actually been in power now for a second term, and they've continued to neglect the good people of York Simcoe. Right. I hope the people of York Simcoe remember that they've been let down by the provincial government when it comes to what the member has raised as a serious concern, which is not having a hospital, and the fact that they've been in power now, majority government, for now a second term, and they still haven't actually addressed this problem that the honourable member raised. I think the Conservative government provincially has a lot to answer for, but it also points out what you get when you vote Conservative.
The honourable member for Shefford. There's so much noise, Madam Speaker. Is it my turn? Thank you. Thank you very much. I thank the leader of the New Democratic Party for his speech, and I would like to ask him about one aspect of the motion. This past weekend, I met someone in Quebec who comes from France and is interested in the environment, and that individual told me that we need to take serious action. He was telling me that we can't continue to subsidize oil and gas, and he was telling me that countries that have real GHG reductions are not investing in the oil and gas industry, they are investing in the green transition. So can you talk to us more about taxing record profits? Because taxing record profits would be the opposite of subsidizing multi-billion-dollar subsidies.
Merci.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. Thank you for the question. I absolutely agree. It's very problematic that what we are doing in this country is subsidizing oil and gas with public money. It's unacceptable. What we need to do is use that money to invest more in clean energy. We need to invest more in opportunities to build the economy of the future and to create good jobs, all while reducing our emissions. That's why we've added the part about making oil businesses paying their fair share to bring down emissions.
Before we resume debate, I wish to inform the House that because of the deferred recorded divisions, government orders will be extended by 36 minutes. À l'ordre, conformément à l'article 38.
Order pursuant to Standing Order 38. I would like to inform the House of questions to be raised tonight.
Swan River, Nippewa, the Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke. The Honourable Member for Dauphin, Sun River, Nippewa, carbon pricing. The Honourable Member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke, carbon pricing. And the Honourable Member for Regina, Louvain, carbon pricing. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Elmwood, Transcona.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise and contribute to what I think has become a really convoluted debate about the carbon tax, and I hope to offer a little bit of clarity. To start, I just want to be very clear about what today's motion is about. Today's motion is to remove the GST from all forms of home heating, to make eco-energy retrofits and heat pumps free and easy to access for low-income and middle-class Canadians, regardless of their initial home heating energy source, and to finance these changes by putting in place a tax on the excess profits of big oil and gas corporations. Now, we've heard a lot about the carbon tax so far, and I think one of the things that's important to say, Madam Speaker, is that carbon pricing is an important tool in combating climate change. It's something that the NDP has long supported. It is something that we continue to support. But serious damage was done to the majority consensus on carbon pricing in Canada when the Liberals decided to introduce into the program regional division. That's not fair. It doesn't pass the smell test for Canadians across the country. And for people who care about the long-term future of carbon pricing in Canada, it's important to maintain that majority consensus. And we can't do it with regional schism and division baked right into the program. That's why we were willing to vote for the Conservative motion the other day that said that the pause that applied on home heating oil should apply to all forms of home heating, including natural gas, because we think it's important that we maintain a majority consensus and not introduce a sense of regional grievance. The Liberals have said that's inconsistent of us to do, and that's not true. In fact, as I say, I believe it's a critical part of maintaining a majority consensus for carbon pricing. It was wrong of the Liberals to introduce that level of regional division. How do we know? Well, if anyone had any doubt, when a Liberal cabinet minister from Newfoundland went on CTV News and said that the reason they were doing it was to cover their own political rear in the Atlantic region, and that people who wanted a break on the carbon tax should be voting Liberal, it was very clear that this was a regional policy motivated by the partisan political interests of the Liberal Party. Do the Democrats support that? Absolutely not. And that's why we didn't vote to support that last day when we had a Conservative motion on extending the pause to other forms of heating. Now, have the Conservatives got it right? No, because they want to get rid of carbon pricing altogether, and that's the wrong response. Have they got it right when it comes to our motion on the GST? No, because if they were concerned to actually get it right from an affordability point of view, they would be supporting our proposal on the GST instead of harping on the carbon tax as they've been doing. Why is that? Because a break on the GST for home heating would first of all be consistent with a long-standing policy of not charging GST on essentials. It would be better because it would apply to Canadians across the country. The federal backstop on the carbon tax only applies in provinces that don't have their own provincial price on carbon. BC does, Quebec does, a number of other provinces do. They won't see any relief where, as far as they're concerned. But what they do pay, even if they have a provincial carbon tax, is the GST. So if the Conservatives were really interested in lowering taxes for all Canadians, they would support our proposal on the GST. This is not a new proposal of the NDP on the GST. It goes back to the early days of Jack Layton's leadership, who was elected leader of the NDP almost 20 years ago, Madam Speaker. Furthermore, Conservatives should be interested in supporting our proposal because the GST is charged on the carbon tax. Any other day of the week, these guys would be upset about a tax on the tax. But when we say, hey, let's actually remove the tax that makes sense because it would get rid of that tax for all Canadians and would no longer be a tax on the carbon tax, they say, no, the NDP is flip-flopping, we won't support that, even though it's an opportunity to actually do something for Canadians. The other important reason for supporting the removal of GST instead of the carbon tax is because it applies to all forms of home heating. And we know that there are Canadians who are cash-strapped that already are doing the right thing by having methods of heating their home that don't burn carbon and don't contribute to emissions. There's a lot of Canadians that would like to be in that boat, but they don't have the resources to be in that boat. That's why we're talking about a government expanding a program in order to make those heat pumps available to low and middle class Canadians. But the people that have already managed to make that transition shouldn't be punished, as they are under the Conservative proposal to simply get rid of the carbon tax. If the Conservatives would agree to eliminate the GST instead, the Canadians that already have low or no emission heating sources in their home would likewise get a break, and they too are deserving of assistance in a time of difficult economic hardship. Of course, we know that we can pay for increased access to heat pumps for low and middle income Canadians because we can levy a tax on the excess profits of oil and gas companies. Now, why would we do that? Well, Madam Speaker, profits in the oil and gas industry in Canada between 2019 and 2022 increased by 1,000%. 1,000%, Madam Speaker, over a simple 3-year period. Shane. That is billions of dollars that could be reinvested in lowering emissions and reducing home heating bills for Canadians by transitioning to more efficient forms of heating. Is this some kind of red-eyed socialist idea to go around taxing oil and gas companies? Well, I don't know. Boris Johnson and the Conservatives in the UK implemented a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry there. So I hardly think this isn't about whether you're on the right wing of the spectrum or the left wing of the spectrum. It's about whether you're motivated by a fundamental sense of fairness. And I got to say, this Conservative leader who pretends he goes around the country, he says he's got the backs of working people, should be explaining to them why he doesn't support the removal of GST on home heating, because that is what it would mean to have the back of every working Canadian in this country, whether they heat their homes with electricity, whether they heat their homes with natural gas, home heating oil, whether they do it in Newfoundland or Manitoba or British Columbia or the Northwest Territories. That's what it would mean. But he's not who he says he is. He's not the champion of working class people in Canada. He's an oil and gas lobbyist working in the House of Commons. That's who the leader of the Conservative Party is, and it's why he won't get behind a very common sense proposal to help Canadians with their affordability challenge, to reduce emissions, and to make sure that the people who have really been putting the squeeze on Canadians, which are oil and gas companies, you don't get 1,000% increase in profits over a few years without unfairly gouging your customers. That's exactly what oil and gas companies have been doing. And if you look at the extent to which increases in price for oil and gas are responsible for inflation versus the carbon tax, I got to tell you, Madam Speaker, oil and gas prices are a much higher driver of inflation than the carbon tax, which the Conservatives like to say in here, well, the Government Bank of Canada said it contributes to inflation. Yes, 0.6%. One time, we could get a one-time for 1 year reduction of inflation by 0.6% if we were to remove the carbon tax. And after that, continue to go up. Also, had the opportunity to question the Governor of the Bank of Canada about that at committee, and I think it's important to note that one-time 0.6% reduction in the carbon tax assumes that oil and gas companies aren't going to raise their prices, Madam Speaker. Well, any Canadian that's been observing the oil and gas market knows full well that if they think there's any room to increase their prices, they're going to do it, Madam Speaker. So I humbly submit to you that although we don't know by how much they would raise their prices, I think we know they would, and that means we know that the one-time savings on inflation is a lot less than 0.6%, and then you kind of wonder why you're concerned about it at all when you have a perfectly good and better proposal to eliminate the GST from home heating that would actually do more for all Canadians. So I think, Madam Speaker, what you see is that the NEP has a perfectly consistent position. We're advocating for a measure that we've been advocating for a long time. Why? Because it's the fairest way to do it, because it's consistent with a tradition of not charging sales tax on essential items. In the context of the carbon tax, it's the fairest way to do it because it applies to people no matter where they live in the country. We've been consistently advocating for that. I remember when they had carbon tax motions, they've named some of them as examples of us voting against their motion to axe the tax. Well, for sure, I think there should be a carbon price. Absolutely. I just think it has to be applied fairly across the country, and that the Liberals screwed it up by enacting a policy that meant that it isn't. So yeah, I support carbon pricing. I remember when we proposed amendments to their carbon price motions and said, hey, if you guys really want to get rid of a tax on home heating, work with us to get rid of the GST. You know what they said when we proposed that amendment? What? No. And did you know that in this House, if you have an opposition to a motion, you can't move an amendment without the permission of the mover, which meant we never did get to have a vote on that. We didn't get to have a vote because the Conservatives vetoed a vote on getting rid of the GST of home heating. The so-called champions of tax reduction for Canadians wouldn't know a working partner if they came up and slapped him in the face. And some of us have had the idea, Madam Speaker. Some of us have had the idea. But we haven't, because we'd prefer to preserve a good working relationship to get something done for Canadians. That's why we're here. It's what we're going to do every day of the week, and it's why we've made another attempt today with this motion. I urge them to finally support it.
The honourable member from Battle River Crowfoot is riding on the point of order.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. On a point of order, I'm sure that the NDP House Leader in particular, but certainly all parliamentarians would be very interested to know and to ensure that there is in fact quorum in this place on what is their opposition day motion. So, Madam Speaker, I would ask for a quorum call.
How many online? How many online? 14? Okay. We do have to suspend until quorum is met. We have 14 members now.
To break down silos. We need to work together.
Okay, the House will now resume. Quorum has been met. Yes, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Be a Conservative member in the House to have quorum.
Conservative member in the House. So we are resuming debate. Questions and comments to the Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think that there is some confusion in regards to the positioning that the NDP had taken in regards to the vote from yesterday. And that is when you take a look at the move towards trying to reduce the reliance on oil in order to heat homes, the national program that was announced by the federal government would in fact incentivize people to go from oil to homes. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, and I'm wondering if the member could explain why it is that the NDP doesn't seem to recognize the true value of encouraging people to convert to home heating pumps.
The Honourable Member for Elmwood Transcona.
First of all, I'd just like to say in respect to the quorum call, it's not the first time Conservatives has gone scurrying under their desk when I rise to speak, Madam Speaker. I'm sure it won't be the last. In respect of the question that I was asked, in respect of the some Conservative members may not fit under their desk, but doesn't stop them from trying.
For Mégantic-L'Érable, rising on a point of order. Yes, l'honorable député Mégantic.
The Honourable Member from Mégantic-L'Érable.
The Honourable Member for New Westminster Burnaby, late last week, seeking to constrain the Conservative Party from holding the NDP Liberal government to account. As you will recall, Conservatives asked a number of questions about the opposition motion to provide relief from the carbon tax for all Canadians, home heating, regardless of the source of heat, which was debated on Thursday and voted upon yesterday afternoon. Canadians are struggling with the cost of living. They are looking with the costs to their Parliament to address this concern and provide relief they need to get through the winter, especially the skyrocketing cost of each, which is driven by the Prime Minister's unaffordable carbon tax. Canadians who are looking to their politicians to take action and axe the tax want to know whether the government will or whether the government will use its immense powers and tools to protect itself. This is unquestionably a concern of the administration of the government. Indeed, Madam Speaker, I think your own initial reaction Thursday afternoon provides a pretty good answer here. Ministers and parliamentary secretaries rose to answer each and every one of the questions of concern of the NDP. If the government itself did not feel obliged to answer, surely it wouldn't have. The NDP House Leader centered much of his argument around the January 2014 ruling by your predecessor, the Honourable Member for Regina-Capelle. When you reflect on that ruling, I think it is important to understand the context which precipitated it. There had been a number of questions from both sides of the House concerning senators as well as the internal operations of the other place, political parties and MPs' offices. Furthermore, there was one key passage the NDP House Leader omitted from the January 2014 ruling, which he otherwise quoted extensively, I must say. So, quote, "The principle of responsible government is that the government has to provide an accounting for where the money goes and to provide reasons for why decisions are made," end quote. As I pointed out in my initial comments, we have a right to understand how the confidence and supply agreement between the Liberal and New Democratic parties will apply to key budget decisions and to important parliamentary decisions. If I might cite the agreement itself, I quote, "The agreement means that the NDP agrees to support the government on confidence and budgetary matters, notably on budgetary policy." End quote. The carbon tax represents a huge chunk of money taken out of taxpayers' pocket. It is indisputably a question of budgetary policy, and one where the government is starkly offside the views and needs of the Canadians whom they govern. That is why the official opposition, through its questioning, was looking for the government to explain the reasons why decision has been made. As for the arguments advanced by the honourable members for Kingston and the Island and Elmwood-Transcona, I would submit that they got sidetracked by the description of the NDP Liberal coalition. Just yesterday, in fact, we saw the New Democrats vote in support of Liberal time allocation or closure for a 37th time under the leadership of the member for Burnaby South. Throughout the CCF and NDP's history prior to its current leader, I believe they had only supported time allocation or closure a total of 14 other times. 37 times. And now 14 only other times before. At the start of this week, I understand that the New Democrats voted with the Liberals 296 times during the past 306 votes. That's 97% support, Madam Speaker. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Chief Government Whip actually considers the NDP caucus to be more reliable in their votes than the member for Beaches East York. On the narrowest point about cabinet seats, which the Deputy Government House Leader and the member for Elmwood-Transcona made, it is true that the NDP clearly failed in their negotiation to secure caucus representation at the cabinet table. However, all other signs point to a cohesive team acting in concert for chamber and committee businesses. But, Madam Speaker, the facts are quite clear that the confidence and supply agreement amounts to a parliamentary coalition, complete with obligations to consult, to discuss voting intention, to provide parliamentary support to the government, and is complete with various mechanics like leaders' meeting, House leaders' meetings, whips meetings, and a special stock-taking committee, which also meets regularly. I believe the member for Elmwood-Transcona might actually be a member of the last group, Madam Speaker. Seeing how spectacularly the Liberals and the Prime Minister have been tumbling in public opinion lately, it is a little surprised that the New Democrats bristle at the coalition level. Madam Speaker, the concern about what label to apply to this relationship between the Liberal and New Democratic parties amount to a question of debate. We have a lot of those during question period. I'm sure you would agree with that. No matter how you cut it, or which term from the dictionary you prefer, we are talking about two entities coming together to collaborate in pursuit of common goals. Whether you prefer to call it that a joint endeavor, a common venture, a partnership, or a coalition, that choice is ultimately a question of debate. It should not be for the Speaker to police debate in the House with a dictionary to enforce the preferred message discipline of any given side. Debate itself has always been useful in shedding light on the truth, and it should continue to do so. In closing, the questions which Conservatives have been raising are important and fall squarely within the administration and conduct of the government. These are the questions that many Canadians, including the constituents of Liberal and NDP members, have long been asking. When When will the government take the tax off so Canadians can keep the heat on? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Duly noted. After that astounding display of timing, the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona still has 4 minutes on his questions and comments, and was answering a question from the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Madam Speaker, before we restart the clock, I would like to make a quick comment with respect to the member from Mégantic-Clérable, and I will say it in French because he can understand this. Usually, when you intervene on a point of order, it is usually something that is related to something that was raised a few days ago or weeks ago. You wait until the member is speaking and he is done. It's a rule of politeness that we offer here to our colleagues in the House, and I find it very disappointing that he did not wait until my intervention was finished in about 30 seconds to rise and make his point of order.
The issue that the member for Winnipeg North raised is fair in the sense that we do absolutely support it. In fact, the motion here today supports helping people transition off of home heating oil. But his colleague in the Liberal cabinet made it very clear on CTV News that what they were doing had everything to do with partisan Liberal politics in a particular region of the country and very little to do with good policy. Better policy on the affordability front would be to remove the GST to make sure that we don't introduce regional schism to the carbon pricing program, and that it applies equally to all the people, including people who don't create any emissions to heat their home but nevertheless are struggling in a time of affordability. So that is the answer to the question, Madam Speaker.
Okay. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Battlewood Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I find it very interesting and somewhat tragic, actually, that the Liberals and the NDP have, while the Liberals have admitted their carbon tax simply doesn't work, the NDP are now scrambling to try and differentiate themselves from their coalition partners. But, Madam Speaker, what the implications that has upon Canadians is truly the most tragic of all. And we have seen over the last couple of years in this Parliament, dating back to February of 2022, Madam Speaker, that member and all the members of the coalition voted against a Conservative motion that would have, in part, removed GST from home heating fuels. They voted against it at that point in time, didn't care about affordability there. Then, a great tragedy for Canadians. The same thing took place on April 4th of 2022. The NDP voted with their coalition partners in the NDP against an affordability measure put forward by common sense Conservatives. Madam Speaker, again on June 7th of 2022, the NDP voted against a Conservative measure that would have addressed some of these affordability challenges. Madam Speaker, again on October 24th, 2022, the NDP and the Liberals, they voted against a Conservative measure. Madam Speaker, on December...
Can I ask if there's a question, because we do have to give time to other members to ask questions, please?
There are numerous other examples, Madam Speaker, and it's unfortunate that I can't get through them all. That's how great the hypocrisy is of that member. So
I'll let the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona comment on the comment. Thank you.
What's tragic, Madam Speaker, is that any time we've reached out to work with Conservatives to reduce tax on home heating in a way that's actually fair, they've said no. Why? Because they've built a political campaign around the carbon tax, and the importance of that campaign to them and their own electoral fortunes trumps doing anything for Canadians in a tangible sense, or they could have worked with us on any of those votes to eliminate the GST from home heating. As I say, that's a position they know the New Democrats have held for close to 20 years now, and one that we actually tried to introduce into their motions with amendments that they refused. So if we want to talk about tragedy and who's really committed to trying to make life more affordable for Canadians, the tragic thing is that Conservatives refuse to have a working partner because they want to go to Canadians and tell them that everything is broken. And to the extent that things are broken around here, they're breaking them. And it's dishonest to break things here and then go to Canadians and tell them that somehow the people breaking it are the ones with the answers.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for, okay. The honourable member for, Edmonton Strathcona.
It's very tricky when the member for Edmonton Strathcona sits near the member for Transcona. But the question that I have for my member, every time he stands up in this House, I learn so much from him and so much about the ways that the New Democrats are working very hard to make sure that Canadians, the affordability crisis is dealt with, and that we're also dealing with the climate crisis. What I'd like to hear from him, we talk a lot about how the Conservatives are in the pockets of oil and gas, of big oil and gas, and one of the things that I find very shocking in Alberta is that we lost 1,500 jobs at the same time that these oil and gas companies were raking in massive profits. I'm wondering if he could talk about why the Conservatives never want to talk about the jobs that we lost in Alberta because of oil and gas.
Very brief answer from the honourable member for Transcona.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's true. As oil and gas profits have skyrocketed over the last number of years, employment in the oil and gas sector has gone down. We see Conservatives say they want more business investment in Canada, but Conservative premiers like Danielle Smith have been turning down billions of dollars of investment in renewable energy that can also create a lot of employment for Canadians. That's why the Conservatives aren't who they say they are. Their leader isn't who he says he is.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. There's a couple of ways in which I would like to be able to address the NDP motion today. One of the ones in which I think it's overlooked and underestimated in terms of what I would suggest to you is the damage, whether it's this particular opposition day motion or the previous one that the Conservatives have brought forward just last week and we actually voted on yesterday, Madam Speaker, is in fact concern related to the environment. And when I think of the environment and I think of the Conservative Party, it really highlights an area in which the Conservative leadership is really missing the point. When people say there are climate deniers in society, I look across the way and I see that by the lack of actions and policy enunciations coming from the Conservative Party that could provide the type of assurances to Canadians that they, as a political entity in the House, take the environment seriously. I believe that there are, indeed, climate deniers within the Conservative caucus, and they seem to be winning the day. And it is unfortunate, Madam Speaker, because I believe that the Conservative Party is being very irresponsible. And when you think in terms of their policies regarding environment, if you hunt and find something, you will find that it's exceptionally reckless. Nothing more so than the price on pollution. And to use the price on pollution to demonstrate just how reckless the Conservative Party is, Madam Speaker, on this issue, all you need to do is take a look at the history inside the chamber. Take a look at the history of the leadership of the Conservative Party. Whether you have Stephen Harper saying one thing one day, the Conservatives changing their position, and then a new Conservative leader comes in and takes a totally different position. In fact, that position was incorporated into the election platform of the Conservative Party in the last election, just 2 years ago, Madam Speaker. As all members would know, because I've talked about it in the past and other members have talked about that in the past, where at that time they talked about the importance of a price on pollution. Madam Speaker, that's when every political party inside the House of Commons seemed to recognize that what had taken place in Paris in 2015 made a whole lot of sense. And a big part of that, coming out of the Paris conference, was that the countries around the world and many of their provincial entities or states started to adopt price on pollution. So at one time, it was actually very encouraging when we had all political entities in the House recognizing that, Madam Speaker. But how far we have fallen from that. from a time in which we had 338 Conservative candidates going out with an election platform that said they supported a price on pollution.
That's right.
To today with a shiny new leader
He's new.
saying that we don't believe in a price on pollution anymore. Instead, taking the bumper sticker policy of, I think they got the carbon tax, Madam Speaker. That is what it is that the Conservative Party today is saying. And that's what I mean in terms of reckless. To take a look at the Conservative Party today, and you want to get a sense and just to the degree in which they are reckless, and I would suggest you would take a heck of a risk with the Conservative Party, take a look at the environment and what it is that they're saying or not saying in regards to it, Madam Speaker. I would like to think that the Conservative Party would be a little bit more reflective in terms of what everyone else is talking about in regards to the environment. There is an expectation, Madam Speaker. So I am disappointed, and I think many Canadians are disappointed in the huge vacuum that's taking place within the Conservative Party today in regards to the environment. So yesterday, we have a vote, and the Conservative Party is trying to portray a false narrative. They're actually spreading misinformation in order to justify that false information and manipulation of a particular vote. And let me expand on that, Madam Speaker. The Government of Canada develops a program. And think about this, if you will. You know, there was a time in which people used to heat their homes with coal. In fact, many of those wartime houses, you'll see little things of steel plates.
That's right.
And that's where the coal would go into the home. Many years ago, Madam Speaker, people realized that there are alternatives to coal.
Yep.
And they started to gravitate towards that, Madam Speaker. Fast forward it to today. And you look at it and you say, well, you have heating oil, you have propane, you have natural gas, you have electricity. Those are the issues, and I mean natural gas.
Oh, I said grass.
Yeah, it kind of sounded a little bit like grass even when I said it there, but natural gas. But, Madam Speaker, those are the items that you have in terms of heating a vast majority of the homes, 99% type of thing, Madam Speaker. Right? Now, where does heating oil fit in? Heating oil is exceptionally more costly as a way to heat your home. Natural gas and propane would probably be, next in line of sorts in terms of cost. What has been clearly established, Madam Speaker, is through electricity and heat pumps, it is far more energy efficient, and it's better for the environment, Madam Speaker. Thousands of Canadians have recognized that.
That's right.
You remember false information? I've heard members of the opposite say, well, as a government, we brought forward, maybe a couple of hundred people where we've seen changing over to heat pumps. Like many other things, it's misinformation. It's just not accurate. Through the Greener Homes program, we have seen tens of thousands of people take advantage of the program and convert to alternatives in terms of heating, replacing heating oil, for example, to heat pumps, Madam Speaker. Tens of thousands. And the Conservative Party, in one swoop, will just kind of wave those to the side because it doesn't fit their narrative. Madam Speaker, if you take a look at it, the policy announcement, which is a national announcement, again, the Conservatives, even today during the question period, they try to regionalize it as if it is there for one region of the country, which is just not true, Madam Speaker. They can read into it all they want and try to spread the misinformation, but the bottom line, Madam Speaker, much like the Greener Homes program, it is a national program. Every region of the country is going to be affected by that program, Madam Speaker. When I heard the numbers, what's important to recognize is the biggest province that has the potential to benefit by this is the province of Ontario. They got a 250,000 people or households that are actually heating homes via oil, Madam Speaker. So when you try to give a misleading, false information to Canadians to try to cause division, I find that somewhat regrettable. I believe that the program is in fact sound. From an environmental perspective, and that's why I expressed disappointment with my New Democratic friends, because I think that they're sending a mixed message. Look at the heating pump policy that's been established, putting a pause on the tax and making heating pumps virtually free, Madam Speaker. Anywhere in Canada where we have provinces that are participating in the program, anywhere in Canada, will cause more people to look at this program as a national program which will continue to see Canadians buying in terms of recognizing that changing over is a smart thing to do. The math says that, and it's very clear. If you invest in a heating pumps, Madam Speaker, the cost is substantially less, and over time, you will actually save a considerable more amount of money than it would have cost to put in a heat pump, Madam Speaker. And that is very clear. We have demonstrated that in the past. We know that there's a high level of interest that's there from Canadians because they have literally looked to programs like the Greener Homes program as a way, as a mechanism. We know that other provinces today are now looking at ways in which they can get on board. And I hope the province of Ontario, through Premier Doug Ford, will realize the benefits of encouraging that conversion, Madam Speaker, by participating in it. You know, with the Conservative Party, on the other hand, and I get back to that reckless attitudes that they have. The other day when the leader of the Conservative Party was addressing the House, and I posed the question to the leader in regards to the issue of taxes. And he had indicated to the House, well, and to get the actual quote, I believe it was, all taxes of home heating, let's get rid of them all. Implying that it's not just the carbon tax that he's referring to, but all taxes, including the GST. Remember, it was the Conservative Party that put in the GST on that, Madam Speaker, on the home heating? Now, the refreshed far-right elements of the, I was going to say Reform Party, but today's Conservative Party, Madam Speaker, they're changing again in that reckless fashion. Because they're not necessarily concerned about sound policy that's in the best interests of Canadians, whether it's the environment or the issue of taxation, and that's an important issue. After all, that's the way we finance and fund the many different programs that are out there. They're more concerned about that bumper sticker, Madam Speaker. That's where their concern is. They want to make sure that they can fit something on a bumper sticker so that when they go around, they say, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and they throw in the common sense, thank you, and the whole home and spin around and bring it home thing, Madam Speaker. That's what the Conservative Party today is all about. It's all a game. It's all of a manipulation, Madam Speaker. I think that they're underestimating the importance of when it comes time to present something. And we wait. I don't know how long we've been waiting for now for the Conservative Party to come to the table and share with Canadians through the House or in some of their meetings in terms of what it is that they're going to do with regards to the environment. We're all waiting to see something coming from the Conservative Party of Canada on the issue, Madam Speaker. But when you take a look at the policy and you combine the two, the issue of affordability, the issue of supporting the purchasing and acquiring and installing of heat pumps, it's a sound policy. And that's why, as I indicated in the question that I had put to my New Democratic friends, how do they justify not supporting that particular policy, Madam Speaker? Because it does send a mixed message. Earlier today, I posed the question in regards to the GST. Today, the New Democrats are kind of buying into some of the things that the Conservatives are saying when they say we just want to get rid of the GST on home heating. Think in regards to what that actually means. They say the purpose of getting rid of the GST on electricity, on natural gas, is so that they can have more money for individuals that want to be able to heat their homes. Now, the problem with that is that when you purchase your electricity, it's more than just for heating homes. In the summer in Winnipeg, you don't need to heat your home.
No.
When it's plus 35 outside, I don't think there's any furnaces, electric or natural gas, that are being used to heat. Home. Madam Speaker, are we saying, for example, if you consume both natural gas and you consume electricity and you have a propane tank, are we saying that all of those are going to be exempt for that one household? That's in essence what it is that the NDP are saying. Who are going to be the biggest benefactors of that policy, Madam Speaker? I would suggest to you it's not going to be the middle class. Remember in the last budget, we brought in the rebate, the grocery rebate. Where did the money come from in order to support that, Madam Speaker? It was through the GST. That's what allowed us to provide that particular support. And by doing that, Madam Speaker, who did we help the most? We helped 11 million Canadians plus. The middle class, those in terms of the lower end income, to get money directly into their pockets so that they would be in a better position to be able to have a higher disposable income to support groceries, Madam Speaker. Well, what is it that the NDP are proposing today? Someone pointed out Mr. Whalen will be one of the biggest benefactors.
It's a big house, I imagine.
He's got a fairly big house, not to mention probably other luxury items. You know, the 1% wealthiest in Canada are probably going to get the biggest reward on this particular motion that the NDP are bringing forward. Think about it, Madam Speaker.
100%.
You know, a fixed income senior living in an apartment versus the 1% wealthiest and where they might be living, and the type of resources that they would be spending that would consume electricity, propane, and natural gas, Madam Speaker. What about pointing out, how does this policy help? Madam Speaker, I would suggest to you that there is a better way to be able to support Canada's working class and those aspiring to be a part of it, and those that we want to help, Madam Speaker, in a more direct way. We've seen a national government over the years lift children and seniors and people with disability out of poverty because of targets. I would suggest to you that this is an irresponsible way for the New Democrats, and it's unfortunately because I think they're being heavily influenced by the Conservative Party. They need to get away, get a little bit more distance from the Conservative Party, and they'll have a healthier party in the future.
A costly coalition.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Skeena Buckley Valley.
Madam Speaker, I tried to follow that stream of consciousness, and I was struggling, but you know, at one point, I believe the parliamentary secretary was trying to make the case that somehow the GST is a progressive tax, and yet nothing could be further from the truth. The GST as a consumption tax imposes a higher burden on low-income people as a percentage of their income. Does he not agree, or would he like to take his 2-minute response and talk about how he doesn't understand what a progressive tax versus a regressive tax is as a concept? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Well, Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, I want the member to think about what he just said. If that's the case, if he truly believed that, then why would the NDP support the GST? What he's saying is that he wants to see the GST taken off home heating. So if he really believes what he just said, what he would be articulating is that we should be getting rid of the GST, period. But of course, Madam Speaker, it's not true what he just finished saying, because if you factor in the GST rebates, it is a progressive form of taxation because of the rebates. I don't think that was explained to the member, or maybe if he does believe that all GST should be taken away, period. And then would he apply that to the provincial sales tax that many New Democratic governments have, Madam Speaker, put into place, supported, increased, and so forth? At least we provide a rebate that makes it progressive.
The Honourable Member for York Simcoe.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I always enjoy listening to the member from Winnipeg North. I would say, you know, from a York Simcoe perspective, since 2018, we are still waiting for the $40 million commitment for the Lake Simcoe Cleanup Fund. We still don't have it. The Freshwater Action Plan, we're still waiting. Municipalities are calling me for that money. You know, we're still waiting for our trees to be planted. You know, Madam Speaker, York Simcoe, and I'm proud of this, has planted more than 5,000 trees on Canada Day barbecues right across York Simcoe, so I'm proud of that. But I'd like to ask the member, you know, we know that, you know, rural Canadians are disproportionately affected by the carbon tax. And, you know, for the people of York Simcoe, we were shocked to learn that we are now considered Toronto, the soup and salad bowl of Canada, the ice fishing capital of Canada, which I know I've invited the member to come ice fishing, and he hasn't taken me up on that. All the rural farms in Pefferlaw, we are not going to get the rural top-up, the meager rural top-up. I wonder if the member could comment how he thinks that's fair for the residents of York Simcoe.
The Honourable Member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, the member started off by talking about Lake Simcoe and concerns in regards to the lakes in his community. You know, when I was in opposition, I had a great deal of concerns for lakes around the world. When, in fact, Stephen Harper then said that he cut funding to the Experimental Lakes project, which had a profound negative impact in regards to the whole area of science and research research in terms of the health of lakes, not only in small communities, but in communities throughout the world. And I'm glad to say, Madam Speaker, it's one of the things that as a government we did quickly after forming government is reestablish the importance of lakes in Canada, Madam Speaker. And today, the Environmental Lakes project is doing exceptionally well, and the government has taken a very proactive approach in regards to protecting ocean waters and doing what we can to support municipalities in making sure that we have good quality water.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech. I would like to recenter the debate. We're talking about helping the lowest income household. Now, according to Net Energy Efficiency Canada, well, when it comes to federal government environment programs, they exclude Quebec. But in Quebec, we mostly use electricity, which is a cleaner energy. And I wonder if it's not the same issue with the Green Fund, because the CEO of a volunteer group in my riding, Cap Farnham, in my riding of Shefford, they recently wanted to be because the city gave them a beautiful building, but the building needs a lot of love. So they did a lot of research to be able to access the Green Fund funding, and they saw that the fund is distributed elsewhere, but not in Quebec. There should be really a program to help households and organizations in Quebec, a program to improve the energy efficiency and eco-efficiency of buildings. All buildings should be included in this program. The people of Quebec and the organizations of Quebec should receive help.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm afraid my colleague is just underestimating in terms of the sense of commitment that come from the people of Quebec in terms of conversions. You know, Quebec is actually leading the country in terms of taking up the Greener Homes program, which is a wonderful program going into the thousands of people in Quebec that have recognized the value of heat pumps. And I see that as a very strong thing as the Government of Canada provides good, sound national programs to encourage people to look and take conversion very seriously. And through that particular national program, I would encourage people to look at the province of Quebec and look at the take-up. The number of people in Quebec is far higher than any other province in Canada, including the province of Ontario, from what I understand, under that particular program.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by saying one aspect of Winnipeg North that I really appreciated was helping to articulate, my surprise as well that when we're talking about removing GST from home heating, that there's nothing about income testing on it in today's motion. I was surprised to see that. I'm unsure why that was the case. For windfall profit tax on oil and gas companies. As he knows, the carbon tax went up only 2 cents a liter last year, and there are rebates attached to that expense. When it comes to the profits of oil and gas companies, though, they went up 18 cents a liter, and there are no rebates attached to that. It's part of why oil and gas companies are making record-breaking profits, and a windfall profit tax could generate $4.2 billion for climate solutions. Does he support a windfall profit tax on oil and gas companies' excess profits?
Our Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker, and to be completely honest on this, I'm not too sure in terms of the details in terms of what it is that the member is making reference to. What I do know is that we believe in a fairer taxation, and people should be expected to their fair share of taxes. So, for example, in a budget where we brought in a temporary Canada recovery dividend, which applied to banks and insurance companies, which will generate several billions of additional dollars from excess profits. And I do believe that there's ways in which we're looking at
Honourable for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'm thrilled that members from the Liberal Party are excited about me being able to ask the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary a question. Now, Madam Speaker, what I find very, very interesting is you unpack a little bit of what that member said. And I would suggest maybe that they should stop handing out the tinfoil hats back in the Liberal lobby, because there is conspiracies that abound when it comes to what they're accusing Conservatives of, and when the reality and the facts are this. In fact, the Environment Commissioner recently released a report, Madam Speaker, that definitively said, and could not have been clearer, that the Liberals are failing, Madam Speaker. Now, that member made some pretty significant accusations to members of the Conservative Party. I'm wondering if he would be willing to name any so-called climate deniers within our caucus. If he's going to throw out accusations like that, have him name them, to stand behind his words, or is he just fear-mongering like the rest of them?
Parliamentary Secretary, a brief answer.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, there's actually 5 political party entities inside the chamber. There's only one political party that continues to deny climate change. And the member makes reference to tinfoil hats. Like, really, Madam Speaker? It is the Conservative Party.
Has had an opportunity the honourable member had an opportunity to ask a question, and other members seem to want to either answer or make comments. I would ask them to please wait until the appropriate time to do that. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Hold on, I have a point of order. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Madam Speaker, that member is very specifically demeaning the integrity of others within this place, and I believe if you would...
This is a point of debate is where the honourable member is going. The honourable member will please sit down. What he is doing is a point of debate. The honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The other thing I have to respond to is the member made reference to tinfoil hats. Well, there is a monopoly on tinfoil hats, and it's on that side of the House, on the left corner, Madam Speaker, better known as the Conservative Party, where they take this point, that point, this point, this point, this point, bring it all together, and somehow it's something really, really bad, Madam Speaker. It's called fake news, false facts, call it whatever you want. The tinfoil hats are always on sale at Amazon. I recommend that's where the member should to look for his.
Resuming debate, the honourable for West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country. They want to have conversations. They should take it outside of this chamber. The honourable member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to rise again in this House. Before going any further, I'll note that I will be splitting my time with the member from Milton. You know, it is maybe a little frustrating that, again, we have a motion where we're debating the carbon tax in this place. And as I suggested in a speech on last Thursday, is when we keep talking about the carbon price in this way, it gives the false impression that it's the price on pollution that's actually leading to the large increases we're seeing on home heating oils and fuels across the country. So today we're debating a motion, an opposition to a motion that's been put forward by the NDP. And what I do appreciate about this motion is it does actually identify what is causing the record increases in fuels that we're seeing within Canada. By way of example, Madam Speaker, since 2020, we know that the increase in the price of home heating oil in Atlantic Canada, only 12 cents of that is from the price on pollution, and actually 63 cents of that is because of the massive excess profits that are being made by the fossil fuel sector. And Madam Speaker, I think it's important that we recognize why that's happening. Of course, with natural gas and with oil, these are global markets. And what we're seeing right now is instability throughout the world, particularly the illegal and unjustified Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has caused significant disruption to the global energy market. We're seeing the actions of OPEC, which is constricting the supply of energy across the world. And so we're seeing massive increases in the cost of energy in Canada as a result. And just, Madam Speaker, just since 2022, the oil and gas sector in Canada has made a $30 billion increase in profits, which is a 1,000% increase since 2019. And Madam Speaker, at the same time we're seeing these record profits take place, we're seeing thousands of jobs being cut right across the country. So I do appreciate that this motion that the NDP put forward looks at this as a problem. And unfortunately, Madam Speaker, it goes beyond this. While I think there's a very good discussion to be had about putting in an excess profits tax on oil and gas companies and being able to use the profits from that to invest in the transition that's taking place. And it's very important that as part of this motion, there is discussion on ensuring that this financing goes to support things like heat pumps and other ways of reducing home heating bills for Canadians. And as the member, the parliamentary secretary said earlier, there is issues with how it's been articulated in scrapping the GST on home heating fuels, given that that actually might not assist the most vulnerable in Canadian society right now. But what I really find frustrating, Madam Speaker, that the NDP in fact voted on scrapping the price on pollution for all home heating fuels right now. And I think, again, this sends the wrong message right now, and again, focuses on the price on pollution as a problem when really it is such a small portion of that. And Madam Speaker, we know that having a price on pollution is the most efficient way of reducing emissions, the most cost-effective way. The province that I come from, British Columbia, has had one for over 15 years. Of course, this was a price on pollution that was brought in by the right of centre government at that time. And while the federal system does not apply in British Columbia, the federal system that we have put forward actually provides rebates that's sent out quarterly to Canadians so that 8 out of 10 Canadians gets more back than they pay into it. So importantly, Madam Speaker, when we're talking about cutting the price on pollution for these fuels, it's actually going to reduce the rebates that people are getting. So in many ways, it actually undermines the affordability measure that's there. And it's through measures like this, Madam Speaker, that Canada has been able to make significant progress in recent years on reducing emissions. And in fact, since 2019, or rather, from 2019 to 2021, emissions in Canada have gone down more than any other G7 country. Obviously, we have a lot more to do, but our price on pollution is part of, a very important part of Canada's emissions reductions plan to make sure that we get there. So, Madam Speaker, I submit it's fundamental that we do not do things that undermine the price on pollution. For this mechanism to be effective, Canadians need to know that it's going to be in place for the long term and that it will be increasing over time as well. Because without this, Madam Speaker, individuals won't make the investments in measures that will actually reduce emissions and at the same time save on their pocketbooks as well. But similarly, Madam Speaker, it's incredibly important that we not only have certainty with the price on pollution for individual consumers, but also at the industrial level. On that regard, we are moving forward with the Canada Growth Fund, which, amongst other things, will be able to bring in things like carbon contracts for differences that will provide the certainty for industry that even if there is a change in the carbon price over time, that they'll have the security in making those investments. So, and it's incredibly important that we have this, Madam Speaker, because we're not seeing the type of investment at the business level in abatement of emissions. Just a couple months ago, or last month rather, on the Finance Committee, we heard from our witnesses that, in fact, over the last 2 years, while the oil sands have been making record profits, there has been zero new investments made in mitigation of emissions. So it's critically important that the private sector and industry plays their part. So we need to make sure that we have the system in place to ensure that they're able to do that and, in fact, are pushed to do that. Another measure that we're in the process of developing right now is a regulation that will cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. And again, Madam Speaker, this is critically important so that those companies right now, which are making record profits while they're cutting jobs, actually invest in measures that will reduce emissions. But Madam Speaker, I am having a bit of a deja vu here with the NDP. In fact, the provincial NDP. I remember back in 2009 when the provincial NDP ran their entire campaign on axing the carbon tax. So I think it's critically important that we focus at this point on reducing emissions while we're there to support affordability for Canadians. But what I am heartened by, Madam Speaker, is that we are having the type of conversation that we're having about heat pumps. We know that heat pumps are an incredibly good way of reducing our emissions at the household level. And that's why we have announced a new program that's going to be able to provide free heat pumps for people in the 3 provinces that have already signed up for it so that they can move from the most high-emitting fuels, which are also up to 4 times as expensive as natural gas, onto heat pumps. And I've seen analysis that a family in Halifax can save over $1,400 a year by doing this. And this program that we've put together, we're putting the call out to all provinces so that they work with us on being able to provide heat pumps for people to transition for home heating oil onto heat pumps. And just yesterday, Madam Speaker, I was very proud to see my Premier, David Eby, wearing an I Love Heat Pumps shirt. And so I know that there is buy-in at the provincial level in British Columbia, and we need to work together so that we can save Canadians money, as well as reducing emissions at the same time. But Madam Speaker, it's not just about reducing our emissions at the household level and saving Canadians money in that way. We also need to assist Canadians with solutions in decarbonizing across the board. A key measure that we've been working on for several years now is ensuring that we're decarbonizing transportation in Canada. As part of this, we're now providing $5,000 incentives for people to switch to electric vehicles. And actually just last week, I was very, very pleased to now be able to take advantage of that program as well. And I'm part of the 18% of British Columbians that have 18% of new vehicle purchasers in British Columbia that have moved forward with an electric vehicle. So, Madam Speaker, whether it's in decarbonizing transportation, whether it's decarbonizing our home heating, we need to do all we can to support Canadians to make greener choices while having an effective price signal in place. And so, Madam Speaker, I think it's critically important that we do both those things at the same time, and imperative in that is ensuring that we have a robust carbon price so that Canadians know that.
Comments, the Honourable for Edmonton Strathcona. And I would like to just do one quick little comment to my colleague for a speech. His speech was very interesting. Of course, when he talks about the wrong messages being sent, I do have to say that as an Albertan, hearing a minister from the Maritimes, from the Atlantic provinces say
future.
questions and comments, the Honourable for Edmonton Strathcona. I would like to just do one quick little comment to my colleague for a speech. His speech was very interesting. Of course, when he talks about the wrong messages being sent, I do have to say that as an Albertan,
is ensuring that we have a robust carbon price so that Canadians know